everybody. Hope you're doing well. I am your host, Josh Peck. We have a very special episode today. The Essenes, Dead Sea Scrolls, their calendar, what it tells us prophetically, even how the Qumran community came to be, how the Pharisees and Sadducees came to be, how Rome came to be in charge over Israel during the times of Christ and the apostles. We got so much to talk about. Let's jump right into the study. I am so excited about this. I have been almost borderline obsessed with Dead Sea Scrolls, with Essenes, with the Zadokites or Sons of Zadok or the Qumran community, whatever we want to call them. I've been so fascinated with this topic because it really helps fill in a lot of the blanks that we have in Christianity. You know, this all has to do with our roots as Christians, like where we came from. And, you know, kind of just generally speaking, we know, well, we come from the Jews. We come from the Jewish religion, and their Messiah came, and those who accepted it became Christians, and thus we have Christianity today. And that is that is true, but that is a very watered down version. What actually happened, there's some things that aren't known, and there's some things that are known within academia and modern scholarship, but it doesn't typically trickle down to the church. So that's what I'm trying to do. I want to bring this stuff to the church because it is so exciting, and I really think it'll help enrich your I don't want to say your faith, because your relationship with Jesus is the thing that should enrich that. But you do get to learn some more about God. You do get to learn some more about our descendants, our spiritual descendants, how Christianity first started. And amazingly, the Qumran community, the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were actually known to have extremely accurate prophecy, and those prophecies were recorded. And there's a lot of things that we've never heard of before. So we're going to get into all that in this series. Now, before we can really appreciate the content and history of the scrolls, we have to know at least the basics of how they came to be discovered in our modern day and what their role was in ancient history. There are already entire books and videos in existence about the discovery of the scrolls themselves. So I'm only going to provide like a brief review here because I don't want to rehash things that have already been talked about a million times, you know, and I'm sure you guys don't want that either. So we're going to go through a brief review of just how this discovery happened. And then after that, we'll look at the world in which the scrolls were created and that missing 400 years between the Old and New Testament. What really happened there? Because you look at the Old Testament and we understand that pretty well, but then when you get to the New Testament, everything's different. You know, Israel is being ruled by Rome, and there's Pharisees, there's Sadducees, and how did all of this happen? Well, we're going to talk about all that. So let's start with the discovery of the scrolls themselves. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran, which is an area in Israel. It's located on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, hence the name, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was these things were discovered between 1947 and 1956. They were originally discovered by a Bedouin shepherd who was throwing rocks into caves. Some say that he was searching for treasure with his friends. Some say he was just doing it, you know, out of boredom. But whatever the case was, he was throwing rocks into caves and heard some pottery break. So upon investigation, clay vessels filled with ancient scrolls were discovered in the caves. There were between 900 and 1,000 parchments that were discovered, and they all contained sacred writings in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Now, generally speaking, with very few exceptions, these scrolls were discovered to have been written about 100 or 200 years before the birth of Christ. I think there was only one or two that were written in the AD years, you know, and we're not going to really get into those. So all the scrolls that we're going to be talking about throughout this series, any that we mention, these were all written 100 or 200 years before Christ, and that's incredibly important to keep in mind and to remember that, because there's going to be some things when you read through the scrolls. Especially when we get into like a scroll that's called 11Q Melchizedek. I mean, it describes perfectly who the Messiah is, what he's coming to do, and this was written like 100 years before Christ, so we have to remember that. This verified dating of the origin of the scrolls is incredibly important because of the detailed prophecy having to do with the first and the second coming of Messiah. That's right. They actually have prophecy relating to our day, relating to our future, which is just phenomenal, and I can't wait to get into that stuff. Now, Dr. Rachel Elior, she's a professor of Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's done extensive modern-day work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and according to her, Dr. Elior, these scrolls should be divided into the following categories. So 5 different categories here. You have the biblical library, which is the books of the Old Testament. So they had all the books of the Old Testament except Esther, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But there's that category. There's para-biblical writings. So these would have been apocryphal texts such as Enoch and Jubilees. There's the mystical library, which is like the sabbatical Psalms, would be an example of that. A polemic library, which would be like the War Scroll. If you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've probably heard of the War Scroll. It's one of the most famous scrolls that they have, that and the Copper Scroll. But now the Copper Scroll wouldn't be part of the polemic library. That would be like the War Scroll would be a good example of that. And then there's the sectarian literature that talks about their group, their sect. So an example of that would be the Damascus document. Now, in her lecture online that's really informative, it's called Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and Why They Were Forgotten, Dr. Elior explains how all of the books of the Old Testament except the book of Esther were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this exclusion of the book of Esther might provide a clue as to the original purpose of the Qumran scroll collection. So Dr. Elior suggests that the reason that the book of Esther was not included in the Qumran library might have been, because nobody really knows. It actually could have even been an accident. They might have had Esther, and we just didn't find any copies of it because they either were taken when they were taken with them when they left, or they were deteriorated, and we just haven't found them. So there's several things that could explain that, but Dr. Elior suggests that Esther was not included, possibly because it doesn't contain the name of God in it. So all other biblical books have at least some reference to the divine authority of God, but the book of Esther does not. So if the Dead Sea Scrolls were intended to be a library of sacred writings, then a book that does not reference God would not be considered sacred by the parameters of that library. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the Qumran community thought less of the book of Esther or thought that it wasn't inspired text or anything like that. Only that they may not have believed it to belong alongside other scrolls in that particular Qumran library if the purpose of that library was to hold sacred texts. So if that's true, and we don't know if it is, but if that's true, that would mean that the Qumran community who kept this library thought of each scroll as containing sacred texts. And there's a lot of texts in there that aren't included in our Bible, like Enoch, Jubilees, 11Q Melchizedek, Messianic Apocalypse. There's a lot of scrolls like that that aren't included in our Bible, nor should they be. And that's something that we got to keep in mind too. Nobody is saying that these books should have been, well, there are people that say that, but they're wrong. These books should not have been included in our text. What we have in our Bible is what's supposed to be in the Bible. There wasn't some nefarious conspiracy where books were removed maliciously or anything like that. If you actually look into the history of how we got our Bible, maybe we'll do an episode on that at some point on here on JPD Weekly. But if you actually look into the history of that, there wasn't any weird conspiracy thing. It was all appropriately done, and it was all understood. So even ancient Jews, they understood that the books of the Old Testament that we have, that was canon. Now they had a lot of other texts, but there's reasons that that those other texts weren't included in the canon. And even later on with the New Testament writings, there's a lot of reason, there's good reason why other books weren't included in the canon. Not all of them were preserved. For example, there's even like what we find in Qumran are fragments of Jubilees and Enoch. But the current version that we have of like the full text of Jubilees, the dates are all screwed up. The dates are all messed up. They give our current translation, which was translated from other languages into the Ethiopic Ge'ez and then into English. Well, that translation somehow messed up a lot of the dates. So when it says, so-and-so happened on this date or in this Jubilee, in the book of Jubilees, those texts are messed up. Now, we know that the original was not like that. We know the original was different because of the fragments of text that we have from Jubilees. We can compare it, and we can actually see that there's a difference in those dates. But we don't have enough of the original Jubilees to actually piece together a full manuscript. So it wasn't preserved. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't read Jubilees. We can read Jubilees and we can get a lot out of it, but we should never elevate that to the same level of Scripture, if that makes sense. Same with Enoch. The Enoch that we have today, things could have been added or removed, and we only have fragments of Enoch from the Qumran community, Dead Sea Scrolls. So things like that, there's good reason why. For some reason, God chose not to preserve these texts and to have them included in the canon. Now, there are sections that are very helpful, like the book of Enoch. I do believe that there are things in there that are meant for our generation, but not to be included in the canon. Because, again, if you were to include everything in the canon, I mean, you'd have a book that's like way too thick to no one would read it. The Bible's already pretty thick, and it's already hard enough to get people to read it. If the Bible was 2, 3, 4, 5 times the size of what it is now, and that was the canon, who would read it? It would be even harder to get anybody to take the time to do it. So there are good reasons why these things weren't included in the canon, and we should not expect them to be. We should, in my opinion, we should not want them to be included in the canon, but we can read them for some historical context. And the cool thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is they don't contradict anything in the Bible. They fill in some blanks, but they don't actually change anything. Now, all that being said, from our perspective today, like I said a moment ago, we understand the Old Testament pretty well. It begins with the writings of Moses, and it continues on until the book of Malachi. Now, throughout the Old Testament, the Jewish people are waiting for the Messiah to come, a promised individual who would be anointed by God. After Malachi, there is a 400-year gap until the beginning of the New Testament. Now, when we read the book of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, we discover the conditions in Israel are extremely different than they were when we left off from the book of Malachi. So Israel is being ruled by Rome. There are religious leaders called Pharisees and Sadducees. There isn't much explanation in the Gospels themselves on how everything in Israel changed. So this is where we can look to some other texts written within that 400-year gap, including some of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, to help explain the transition between Malachi and Matthew. So this leads us to the silent 400 years and the sons of Zadok. Now, while this 400-year gap between the testaments is typically called the silent years, it turns out that there's actually a really rich history available to us of this time period if we know where to look. So until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the best things that we had available to explain this time period was Jewish history contained in the Talmud. And just to make a quick, brief note on the Talmud, because there's a lot of hatred of this book, like a lot of more than any other book. Look, it's a religious and a historical text. All right, so just like you could look at like the Indian Vedas are kind of like that. And are the Indian Vedas are they anti-Christian? Of course, because they teach a different gospel. They teach a different thing. Is the Talmud anti-Christian? Of course, because of the same reason. It teaches a different gospel. It doesn't teach or preach Jesus Christ. So, of course, there's problems getting any kind of spiritual enlightenment from the Talmud or from the Vedas or from anything like that. But there is history contained in the Talmud that can be very beneficial. Now, of course, it always helps if you're going to take history and separate that from the spiritual teachings. If you're just going to take the history, it always helps to have other sources to help confirm what the Talmud is telling about Jewish history. And just like any other text, it can't just be trusted blindly. I mean, you can do that with the Bible, but even that, you have to be careful. Are you trusting the Bible, or are you trusting your own interpretations? And you can't just trust your own human interpretations blindly. So there is kind of this irrational fear and hatred of the Talmud. There's a lot of, and we will do a whole episode on this. There's a lot of claims going around online about the Talmud that it says certain things about Jesus, and it's just, long story short, there's no reason to believe that those are true. You could interpret things in a certain way, just like you can do with any text, but there's no real reason to fully believe that was the intended interpretation of those scripts when they were first written. Now, again, there's a whole thing on that we will have to get into in a different episode. I don't want to go on too much of a rabbit trail here, but I just wanted to address that, yes, there is an irrational, just vitriolic hatred and even fear of the Talmud itself, but it's really just like any other, pseudo-spiritual historical text out there. No, it does not teach anything good about Jesus, of course, so we don't use it for spiritual enlightenment. And again, a lot of the blasphemous stuff that people claim is in the Talmud, they don't have a real reason to interpret it that way. But again, we'll have to get into that in a different episode. But just suffice to say, we can look for some history in there, but it always helps, and we should do this with any historical text, even Josephus. We should do this with any historical text. It always helps to have confirmation from other sources. So if we can do that, that helps. Like, for example, Josephus, he's amazing he's amazing at history, but historian, that's what I was looking for. But the problem is I believe he was going by some Greek translations that had the dates messed up. So even in the works of Josephus, when he gives like ages or dates, or they're not correct. Some of them are kind of messed up. So we always have to look at that stuff, but we don't have to just say that under no circumstances at all, no matter what, should you ever look at the Talmud, no matter what. I think that is going a little far, and it's kind of ridiculous. You can look at it. It is a historical text. It is a text that was written historically, and you have to take it in the context that it was meant to be understood. And, of course, it is not a Christian text, not whatsoever. There's nothing Christian in it, but it does contain some Jewish history. So up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the best things that we had available to explain this time period, this silent 400 years, was Jewish history contained in the Talmud, the 4 books of the Maccabees, and works of ancient historians such as Flavius Josephus. Now, all of these sources leave some things out, and it can be difficult to piece together every point of history within these 400 years. And even all of these sources kind of have their own slant, because that's just human nature. So, for example, some have said that because Josephus was a Pharisee, that he's a little kinder to the Pharisees than he should have been in some areas. So he may have had a slant, maybe not. Maybe those claims are completely unfounded. But of course, the Talmud's going to have a slant. All of these historical documents are going to have some kind of slant. Christian historians have that as well. There are ancient church father texts that might have a slant. So you got to take each piece on its own and look at it for what it is and make your own determination. But we just have to realize that is human nature. It's always been like that. It always will be like that until Christ returns, until this world is set straight. But, I mean, we even have that in the mainstream media today, so we should expect that we're going to find that in historical texts as well. So this is all that we've had to really piece together those 400 years until the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they have helped quite a bit since their discovery and publication. So it all begins with a command of God to Aaron, recorded in the Torah, that priests of Israel were only to come through Aaron's family from the tribe of Levi. So we get this from Exodus 28:43 through 29:1a. From the New King James Version, it says, they shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they come into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister in the holy place. that they do not incur iniquity and die. It shall be a statute forever to him and his descendants after him. And this is what you shall do to them to hallow them for ministering to me as priests. And we have another one. We have another reference to this too that says, quote, then the Lord said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear the iniquity related to the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear the iniquity associated with your priesthood. Also bring with you your brethren of the tribe of Levi, the tribe of your father, that they may be joined with you and serve you while you and your sons are with you before the tabernacle of witness. They shall attend to your needs and all the needs of the tabernacle, but they shall not come near the articles of the sanctuary and the altar, lest they die, they and you also. They shall be joined with you and attend to the needs of the tabernacle of meeting for all the work of the tabernacle, but an outsider shall not come near you, and you shall attend to the duties of the sanctuary and the duties of the altar, that there may be no more wrath on the children of Israel. Behold, I myself have taken your brethren, the Levites, from among the children of Israel. They are a gift to you, given by the Lord, to do the work of the tabernacle of meeting. Therefore, you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything at the altar and behind the veil, and you shall serve. I give your priesthood to you as a gift for service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. And that is from Numbers 18, 1 through 7. And again, we were reading from the New King James Version. All right, so Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Levi was the father of Kohath, who was the father of Amram, who was the father of Aaron and Moses. So this is how the line of Levi connects down to Aaron and Moses throughout time. Now, instead of just any Levite being a priest, God narrowed it down to Aaron's descendants. And that can be a bit confusing, as we actually have two individuals named Zadok in the priestly line. So throughout the Old Testament, we see this priestly line narrow down to the first Zadok, who is the 12th from Aaron, and then to a second Zadok, who was high priest during the construction of the first temple during the days of David and Solomon. Now, according to the book of Ezra, the first Zadok mentioned was the 12th from Aaron. And the family line from Aaron to the first Zadok is as follows. So we have Aaron, Eleazar, Phinehas, Abishua, Buki, Uzi, Zerahiah, Merioth, Azariah, Amariah, Ahitub, and Zadok. In the book of First Chronicles, we see the family line from Ahimaaz, son of the first Zadok, to the second Zadok, and we see that that is as follows. So we already looked at the first 12. So now after that first Zadok, we have Ahimaaz, Azariah, Yohanan, Azariah, Amariah, Ahitub, and Zadok. So, that can get kind of confusing because a lot of those names are repeated. A lot of the names are the same, but these are different individuals. So that second Zadok is the individual referred to when the term sons of Zadok comes up throughout the rest of this book. Now, King David set up Zadok and Ahimelech, I don't know exactly how to say that, Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, as priests. So King David set up Zadok and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, as priests. Now, later in the days of Solomon, we learn in the Bible that there was some rebellion. So Adoniah was attempting to secure the throne, and Abiathar sided with him. Now, through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Solomon expelled Abiathar from Jerusalem and gave the priesthood over to Zadok. And then after that, and from that time forward, high priests were to come through the line of Zadok. So after the second Zadok, his family line, which is sometimes called the Zadokite dynasty or sons of Zadok, Zadokites, that family line is as follows. It continues on. Shalom, Hilkiah, Azariah, Sariah, and Jehozadak. So that gives us 24. It gives us a line of 24 there. So we learn that Jehozadak went into captivity with Jerusalem and Judah by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So this provides us with the 24 descendants from Aaron to the time of the Babylonian captivity. Now, after the Babylonian exile, Zadok's family line of high priests continued until Jason, son of Simon II, and that was around 175 to 172 BC. And he was the last of the Zadokite dynasty, last of the Zadokites that were priests. So in 175 BC, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Antiochus Epiphanes IV, or just Antiochus Epiphanes, which many of you have probably heard of. He was a Hellenistic king, extremely evil. He was from the Seleucid Empire. He conquered Israel, and he deposed the rightful high priest Jason and appointed Menelaus as the new high priest. Antiochus outlawed Jewish religious rituals. He slaughtered a pig in order to desecrate the Jewish temple, and he ordered the Jews to worship Zeus as the supreme god instead of Yahweh. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus writes, quote, "Now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking of the city, Jerusalem, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there. But being overcome with his violent passions and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country and to keep their infants uncircumcised and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death." Now, according to the book of First Maccabees, Mattathias the Hasmonean began the revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and the Seleucid Empire in 167 BC. He did this by refusing to worship the Greek gods, and he killed a Greek officer who was attempting to enforce a sacrifice to an idol, and he also killed a Jew who had stepped forward to do the sacrifice. So after this initial revolt, Mattathias and his five sons fled into the Judean wilderness. Now, after Mattathias died about a year later in 166 BC, one of his sons, named Judas Maccabee, led. Sometimes he's referred to as Judah Maccabee, but Judas, it's the same person we're talking about. Judas Maccabee led an army of Jews into many battles against the Seleucid rulers and any who sided with them in Israel. The Maccabees were victorious against the Seleucid Empire and were able to cleanse the temple, and that actually resulted in the creation of a new holiday in Israel, Hanukkah. And they were able to reestablish worship of Yahweh and Jewish rituals, and installed Judas's younger brother, Jonathan Aphus, also called Jonathan the Hasmonean, as high priest. So he wore the garments of the high priest and officiated for the first time on the Feast of Tabernacles in 153 BC. Jonathan was the first priest in the Hasmonean dynasty. That's what they call it. Now, of course, it's generally understood as a good thing that the Jewish people were able to escape their persecution of their oppressors. However, it wasn't a perfect restoration, because for those who followed the books of the Old Testament, Jonathan Aphus should have never been made high priest because he was not a Zadokite. He was not one of the sons of Zadok. He didn't come from that line, so he never should have been made high priest. Now, history itself even seems to show that the Hasmonean dynasty was not blessed by God to take over the priesthood, as this was just the beginning of the increasing corruption in Israel's leadership until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, that's not to say that God didn't bless the Jewish people being released from their captors, because clearly we have Hanukkah. We have a miracle that was done that God did. And so they could cleanse the temple. So clearly God blessed at least that, but the priesthood itself this was just the beginning of corruption that overtook Israel and led to what we see in the New Testament. So it seems that God did not bless the priesthood itself. So there's a clear distinction between those two things. Now, even more, the Hasmoneans had no ties to the Davidic line from which legitimate kings of Israel were supposed to descend. But they still took up kingship. So even in that regard, they never should have been priests or kings. Now, this actually leads to the origin of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and this leads further into our study of how we got to the times of the New Testament. Now, the chronology of events concerning the origins of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Qumran community, it is explained in the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as other historical texts. But what's interesting is you can see a clear difference in the way these things are explained in the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Talmud is a body of Jewish texts that have been written by Orthodox rabbis throughout time who originally came from the ancient Pharisees in the 1st century. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by Jews who completely disagreed theologically with the Pharisees and, by extension, the Sadducees. So because of that, while many of the historical details tend to agree, the way that they're presented varies quite a bit between those two sources, the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scroll. Now, Dr. Ken Johnson, author of several groundbreaking books concerning the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient Near East, he has taken great care and time to go through the ancient sources, such as the Talmud, Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, etc., in order to piece together the history of the Pharisees, all of which he explains in a presentation that you can find on YouTube called Origin of the Pharisees. And this is from his Prophecy and Chronology Bible study series. Again, you can find that on YouTube, Dr. Ken Johnson. Please subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. He is fantastic. But he explains how there was a time prior to Antiochus Epiphanes when the Jewish people would discuss theology and offer differing opinions amongst each other peacefully as brothers. However, over the course of time, something happened that caused groups of opinions to form, break apart from one another, and even become so emboldened by their differences in opinions that they tried to kill those who disagreed. And this is actually a parallel we can look to at our time that we're seeing. And this was an apostasy of their time. We're seeing that type of apostasy within Christianity start. Now, we might not have Christians killing other Christians for their opinions just yet, but it seems like we're headed there. So there seems to be a principle that at the end of an age, there's a great apostasy like this. And we saw it at the end of the age of Torah. So this, and we'll get into ages in a future video, in a future part of this series. But all that to say, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, there were Jews who rebelled, but there were also those who went along with the Seleucids and became Hellenized Jews. So after the Maccabean revolt and the retaking of Israel by the Jews, there were still Hellenized Jews in the land, along with Torah-believing Jews. There had been Jews that sided with the government and they felt it was better to go along with whatever the foreign rulers said, while there were other Jews who felt going along with the government when it conflicted with their understanding of Torah was completely inappropriate. So on top of that, the line of Maccabees, who eventually decided they wanted to hold the office of king as well as priest, which was forbidden according to Jewish understanding because priests were supposed to be from the line of Zadok and kings were supposed to be from the line of David. So you had all of this going on. Now, in 110 BC, the Jewish leadership was able to get Rome to recognize Israel as a sovereign nation, an independent Hasmonean kingdom. And after that, the leadership decided to initiate conquests. They would attack the surrounding tribes and people groups, make them become Jewish by getting circumcised, forcing them to eat kosher, etc. Now, this was all against Jewish understanding of Mosaic law because Gentiles were not to be forced into Judaism. They could convert on their own and become Noahide believers called proselytes. But this was supposed to be done voluntarily. And even then, there were certain Jewish rituals and activities and roles that they still were not supposed to participate in as Gentiles. So, for example, no Gentile was supposed to be a king of Israel. And we actually do get that in the Bible. Deuteronomy 17:14 through 15 says, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So Gentiles were not supposed to be kings. In fact, there was even a distinction between Jew and Gentile when it came to the Mosaic food laws. So in short, Jews had to keep kosher while Gentiles were not required to do so, which is really interesting when we think about like the Hebrew roots movement today. But Deuteronomy 14:21 says, and this is from the ESV, it says, you shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who is within your towns, that he may eat it. So this would have been Gentile people living in Israel. Or you may sell it to a foreigner. You may sell it to a Gentile. For you are a people holy to the land your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So this idea that Gentiles are supposed to take on the Mosaic law, that is refuted by Scripture itself. Because again, Deuteronomy right here, God is giving permission for Gentiles who are living in Israel, Gentiles, to eat kosher. Now, would God, if not eating kosher, if eating something that wasn't considered kosher was a sin, would God permit somebody to sin? Would God give permission for somebody to sin? Would he be okay with that? Of course, the whole idea of the whole Hebrew roots movement is to suggest that God takes sin so seriously he would never permit anybody to go into sin. So how do we explain Deuteronomy 14:21 then? Because God is giving clear permission for foreigners, for Gentiles, to eat unclean, to eat unkosher. And the reason is because these food laws were meant, as it says right in Deuteronomy 14:21, it says, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. These were things for Israel for that time. And when you read later texts, you actually find out that it was symbolic, that I believe it was in the Epistle of Barnabas, but there was an understanding that these laws were symbolic because those animals represented things that the Lord wanted to remind the Israelites not to be like. So, don't eat pigs because a pig represents the type of person that just comes when they want something, and they come around and they use people when they want something, but then when they get what they want, they're gone, kind of like the nature of the animal, a pig, would be. So there's reasons given for that. Actually, Dr. Ken Johnson has an excellent video on YouTube about that, so you can look that up. But anyway, so that kind of flies in the face of the Hebrew roots movement today, and of course, I'm sure they would interpret that differently. But according to just the plain reading of the text, that's what it says. So I believe that the Hebrew roots movement is making the same mistake that Jews during this time were making, because they were going around telling Gentiles that they had to become Jewish and even forcing them into it. Now, there's a lot of other examples throughout Scripture that shows that there is supposed to be a clear distinction between Jew and Gentile. Now that we have Christianity, that wall has been broken down. But that doesn't mean that Gentiles become Jews, and it doesn't mean that Jews become Gentiles. It means that we are all one new man under Christ. So Jews are more than welcome to keep kosher. They don't have to abandon the kosher laws or the kosher food laws to become Christian. But as Christians, they should understand that keeping that law doesn't add to their salvation. They don't get salvation that way. And on the flip side, Gentiles don't have to become Jewish. We don't have to keep food laws in order to get saved, because again, that's not how you get saved, and Gentiles were never required to do these anyway. So we're all to follow the law of Christ, and a lot of that is based on loving God, loving each other. Now, again, some Hebrew roots people would say, well, we show love to God by keeping kosher, and I think if somebody chooses to do that, I think that's fine. However, when it becomes a problem is when it's enforced on other people. So if you're telling other Christians you're not really Christian, or you're not Christian enough, or you don't really love God because you ate a ham sandwich or something like that, That is a problem. That is sinful. Trying to enforce it like that, trying to put that burden on Christians that they have to keep these laws in order to show their love for God. That's not at all accurate. Okay, now, getting back to our study, at that time, there was a separatist group of Jews that formed against those who were trying to force Gentiles into converting to Judaism. So early on, those separatists became the Pharisees, while the priestly sons of Zadok and the Hellenized Jews who wanted to go along with whatever the king and government said to do became the Sadducees, which is strange, but again, this is early on, and these groups were loosely formed. Now, in fact, this is really interesting. The original Hebrew, Pharisee means separated, because they were the first kind of separatist group. And then Sadducee shares with Zadok the root word Sadok, which means to be right or just. Now, of course, the sons of Zadok and the Hellenized Jews had many differences themselves, so even eventually they divided as well. So it's not like that these were in the same camp. It's that they were all Jews at one point. A piece broke off, and that became the Pharisees, and then you had all these other Jews like left over, and then you had the sons of Zadok and the Sadducees separate. Now, after a while, a decision was made among the Pharisees that the priestly code, the duties, responsibilities, the rituals, the practices of priests according to the law of Moses would have to apply to every Jew instead of only priests. So Pharisees came to believe in a broad interpretation of the Torah that included a motivation to make every child of Israel act as priests to fulfill God's word in Exodus 19:3-6 about Israel being his possession and being a kingdom of priests. So eventually the Sadducees got to the point that they stopped believing in angels, life after death, several other important tenets of the Jewish faith of their time, and the sons of Zadok, the actual true believers of the of original like Judaism, the way it was supposed to be at that time, they broke off as well. So just a quick recap for those who might have missed it. There was a time right after the Maccabean revolt, right after they were able to defeat the Seleucids and get their country back, get Israel back. There was a time where everybody kind of got along within Israel, but these different factions started to spring up. So it got to the point where they weren't just discussing differences of opinions as brothers. It got to the point they actually wanted to kill each other over differences of opinions. So originally you had the main Jewish group. You had the leadership, which actually wasn't legitimate according to priesthood and kingship rules that are found in the Bible. In the Torah, they weren't legitimate, so you had problems there. But you had them trying to go off and make Jews out of all of the Gentiles around them, which wasn't supposed to happen. They were trying to force that. So you had the general group of the citizens of Israel, the Jewish people, and you had this piece break off that didn't agree with the leadership, but they also eventually wanted to put the priestly code onto everybody. So that's the Pharisees. The Pharisees broke off and left this larger group. Now, in the larger group, you had Jews that wanted to just go along with whatever the government said. That became the Sadducees. And then you had the rest, which were the true believing Israel, the true believers that were waiting for the Messiah. They were holding true to Torah. They weren't making all these, weird decisions and rulings and weird interpretations. They remained true. And this is what would become the Essenes, the Qumran community, the sons of Zadok, the Zadokites. There's a lot of names for these, and we're gonna sort these out. So to make a long and exhaustive story short, the Pharisees developed what is known as oral Torah, which was a collection of additions to the written Torah of Moses that contained laws, statutes, and legal interpretations, and would later become the Talmud that we have today. So the Sadducees outright rejected this whole idea of oral Torah. So a new group rose out of that controversy, who now were unlike the other two major groups. So they didn't believe in the oral Torah of the Pharisees, or their insistence to put the regulations of priests on every Jew, nor did they follow the Sadducees in rejecting pivotal Jewish beliefs. So the way that this new group should be identified becomes a little bit muddled in our modern day understanding. So some call this new group the Essenes. Some use that general term, the Essenes, and which you very well could. Lots of people do. That's sort of like the general consensus among scholarship today, is that this new group, that this is the beginning of this scene. So you have Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees. That's how all three of these groups came to be by the time that you get to the New Testament. Well, of course, you don't hear about Essenes in the New Testament, but that group did exist during that time. So some say that this new group was the Essenes. That's what we should call them. Others believe that we should call them the priestly sons of Zadok that eventually migrated to Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls and began the Qumran community. So others will say that the Essenes and the sons of Zadok are just two terms for the same community in Qumran. And then others will say that this group became the sons of Zadok, the sons of Zadok community in Qumran, and that the Essenes were just the Jewish believers spread throughout Israel who followed the ways of the Dead Sea Scroll and the Qumran community. Sort of like how Catholic religious authority today is located at the Vatican, but there are Catholic believers spread all over the world. So in that way, you have people who will say that the Qumran community was like the spiritual leadership, sort of, and then the Essenes throughout Israel were the believers in that way of interpretation. Now, in looking at all of the historical records and attempting to piece together some of the differing descriptions, it's my opinion currently that the best explanation is that the Qumran community was made up of the priestly sons of Zadok and a few converts who wished to have more of a leadership role involving a stricter form of ritualistic dedication, and that the Essenes were those Jews throughout Israel who were regular people, not priests, but who followed the theology of the Qumran community. They rejected the Pharisee theology, they rejected the Sadducees theology, and they accepted the Zadokite, or the sons of Zadok, or the Qumran community's teaching of theology. Now, again, this would be comparable to Christian denominations today. Now, though we have many more than just three available to us today, but let's say that an individual might want to make a choice between converting and becoming Catholic, a charismatic, or an evangelical Baptist. Now, if he decides to become a Catholic, he would follow the theology proposed by the Vatican leadership, but he himself would not necessarily have to become a Catholic priest. But in making that decision, he could look at the leadership of each denomination, find out what they believe, and decide who he wants to follow. Now, in that same way, it seems that a similar choice was available to the Jewish people between the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, or the Qumran community, if you're talking about the leadership. But you have Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Now, because of this, throughout the rest of the series, when I want to just generally refer to the followers of the doctrines proposed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, those doctrines in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'll just use the word Essenes. But if I want to specifically refer to the leadership or the community that's found in Qumran that followed and taught the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'll say sons of Zadok or Qumran community. So that's the distinction. That's the difference. It seems like Essenes were all over Israel, but the Qumran community were like the priests or the leadership of that doctrine. Now, my hope is that will help minimize confusion, because it is kind of a confusing topic, and opinions are currently split. So while I'm trying to minimize confusion, just keep that in mind, that today opinions are currently split on this issue in modern academia and scholarship. So the confusion in knowing how exactly to define the Essenes and if they had anything to do with the Qumran community, that comes in because there's actually not much in the historical record about the actual origin of the group known as the Essenes. We get a little bit in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have some writings of Josephus, Pliny the Elder, Philo, Hippolytus of Rome, and a few other sources that describe the group as it existed during the time the source was being written. But that doesn't necessarily contain anything about the origin of the group. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls do, but it's difficult to know how to interpret everything that the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about, because they sort of use code words. They'll say wicked priest, but don't always identify who that is. Things like that. So Philo, we're going to go through some of this stuff that explains who the Essenes were, and to help kind of help us piece together this strange group. Now, Philo in his book, and I don't, Quod omnis probus liber, it's translated that every good man is free. So this is from Philo. He writes this. He writes, quote, "There is a portion of that people called Essenes, over 4,000 in my opinion. They are above all servants, therapeutai of God. They do not sacrifice animals, but study to preserve the sanctity of life. They live in villages, avoiding all cities on account of the lawlessness of those that inhabit them. Some of these men cultivate the soil, others live by peaceful arts and so benefit themselves and all their neighbors. They do not lay up treasures of gold or silver for themselves, judging contentment and frugality, the great riches. With them are no makers of arms or of military engines, and no one is occupied with anything connected with war. They all avoid commerce and navigation, thinking that these employments make for covetousness. They possess no slaves, holding all men to be free, and all are expected to aid one another as real nesiosis, or nesois, I don't know how to pronounce that, each other as real brethren. They devote their attention to the moral part of philosophy, to the neglect of logic, using as instructors the laws of their country, which it would have been impossible for the human mind to devise, save by divine inspiration. They abstain from all work on the seventh day, which they look on as sacred. On it, they assemble in sacred buildings, which are called synagogues, and seated in order according to age, they hear the scriptures, tas biblos, read and expounded. They are thus taught to choose what is right and avoid what is wrong. They use a threefold criterion: love of God, love of virtue, love of man. They carefully avoid oaths and falsehood. They regard God as the author of all good. They all dwell in companies so that no one has a dwelling absolutely his own. They have everything in common: their expenses, their garments, their food. When they work for wages, they do not retain these for themselves, but bring it into the common stock. The sick are not neglected when they are unable to contribute to the common store. They respect their seniors as if they were their parents. Such men never can be enslaved. As a proof of this, none of the many oppressors of their land were able to bring any accusation against the holy Essenes," end quote. Now, I want to make mention of one quick thing here. A lot of times in modern scholarship, when this group is described, sometimes they'll be described as communist. Now, that would be like saying your family at home is communist because you all share wealth. That's not, they weren't doing this as a political movement. And when you really look at the tenets of communism, it has nothing to do with what the Qumran community or the Essenes were doing. They were more like a family unit, just how, like in my family, if I'm making all of the money and I distribute that throughout the members of my family, or everybody in my family has access to that money, to those goods, again, it would be like saying the family unit is communist. While you technically might be able to say there's some commonality there, it's not set up in the family as a form of government. And it was the same as the Qumran community or the Essenes. They would have had no understanding of communism as was proposed in the 20th century. They would have no understanding of that. And because communism is done by force, they likely would have outright rejected it because everything that they did was voluntary. They were not, the Essenes were not into like forcing people into things. Okay, so I just wanted to make mention of that because if you do read some books or you look up some stuff on the Essenes or the Qumran community, a lot of times they are described as being communist or being socialist. That is not at all correct. And that is, there's actually a modern drive to pretty up communism or to pretty up socialism, and because of that, I think that's why they're described that way. But nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, now there are apparent contradictions that can be seen between certain sources. So, for example, in a passage quoted from Philo by Eusebius in Preparatio Evangelica, volume 811, it is said, quote, "Our lawgiver trained 10,000s of his followers and formed them into a community called Essenes from their holiness," end quote. Now, that seems to contradict the over 4,000 figure Philo gave in the previous quote. However, there could be an explanation. It's possible that Philo was working from new information that he later attained, but this does show how identifying the Essenes can be tricky. It could also be that the 4,000 number was from was specifically about the Qumran community, and then the tens of thousands number was generally all throughout Israel. Now, if the interpretation that the Essenes throughout Israel followed the doctrines of the Qumran community, then we can reconcile those two apparent contradictions, because then there wouldn't be a contradiction anymore. They both could be true. So that's kind of part of what leads me to lean towards that being the appropriate definition, that there was a Qumran community that are technically Essenes, just like religious leaders in the Vatican are technically Catholic, but there were also Essenes all throughout Israel that followed their teachings, just like there's Catholics all over the world that follow the teachings of the leadership in the Vatican. Now, the quote from Philo by Eusebius goes on to say, quote, "This sect is not hereditary. There are no children nor youths among the Essenes, such as persons are unstable. No one among them has property of his own. They regard all possessions as part of a common stock. They all dwell in the same place, forming themselves into clubs and societies. They do everything for the benefit of the whole society, but different members take up different employments, laboring ceaselessly despite cold or heat. Before sunrise, they go to their work and do not quit it till sunset. Some are tillers of the soil, some shepherds, some tend bees, some are artisans. These men, when they have received their wages, give them up to the general manager, who purchases what is necessary. Those who live together eat at the same table day after day. Their dress also is common. In winter, they have thick cloaks. In summer, light mantles. Each takes what he wants. When anyone falls sick, he is cured from their common resources. Old men, even if they happen to be childless, are as if they had a numerous offspring of affectionate children. They repudiate marriage because they look on women as a selfish creature and specially addicted to jealousy and hypocrisy, thus likely to dissolve their brotherhood. A man bound to a woman is hampered by his affection, is no longer a free man but a slave," end quote. Now, we'll even see some contradictions there, and that's why I think there was a difference between the Qumran community and general Essenes, because you'll find Essenes that were married, that did have families, and it could be that while that quote kind of sounds like they really had a low view of women, that might not actually be what was going on. It might have been more that, like Paul said, that there's a spiritual benefit to abstaining from marriage because you can do more from God. So we have to take some of these historical sources with a grain of salt. Now, of course, the Qumran community wasn't perfect. The Essenes weren't perfect. They very well may have had a lower view of women, and that doesn't do anything to, hurt any kind of case that we're making here, because it would be, well, they're human and they were wrong to think that. But all I'm saying is that might not have been the reason why they abstained from marriage. This is just this historian's opinion, but he doesn't say what led him to that. Did he hear that from an Essene, or did he just see that there wasn't marriage going on in that community, so he assumed that they had a lower view of women? We don't know. Now, it seems like, according to their teachings, when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, it doesn't, so far, I haven't found anything to suggest that they had a lower view of women, but that they did have a difference of roles, kind of like how we have in Christianity. So they did have, priests that would stay unmarried and that had certain duties that the rest of the general public didn't have. So that kind of thing happens. But it doesn't seem like they viewed women as like unequal or like unequal in value. It seems like that it seems like that they just viewed women the same as anybody else. Again, like how we do in Christianity, men and women, they have different jobs, but they are equal in value, that kind of thing. It seems like that's the case. So I just wanted to make mention of that. But again, we don't really know for sure. There's different ways to interpret these things. Now, in Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, I believe. Yeah, book 18. Flavius Josephus records some further information about the Essenes. So first, he identifies them as a separate group from the Pharisees and Sadducees. He says, quote, "The Jews had for a great while had three sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves, the sect of the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees," end quote. Now next, Josephus offers some additional details about the Essenes, which seems to agree with Philo's previous number of 4,000. So this could be that he's talking about not the general populace of Essenes throughout Israel, but the Qumran community, as a whole, although again, some of the Essenes would have followed some of these things. But there also could have been a difference between like a priestly code and just a general Essene code. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But Josephus says, "The doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure lustrations of their own, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. Yet is their course of life better than that of other men, and they entirely addict themselves to husbandry. It also deserves our admiration how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree that as it hath never appeared among any other men, neither Greeks nor barbarians, no, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long while among them. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs, which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. There were about 4,000 men that live in this way, and neither marry wives, nor are desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust, and the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. But as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. They also appoint certain stewards to receive the incomes of their revenues and of the fruits of the ground, such as are good men and priests, who are to get their corn and their food ready for them. They none of them differ from others of the Essenes in their way of living, but do the most resemble those decay who are called Palestine, dwellers in the cities." End quote. So it seems like this is talking about the group of priests in Qumran and that they resemble those dwellers in the cities, those other general Essenes, if I'm understanding this correctly. But again, it is kind of open to interpretation. It's a little difficult to understand. Now, one of the largest sections that we have about the Essenes comes from chapter 8 of book 2 of the Wars of the Jews by Josephus. You can find that for free online. And that entire section would be too long to quote in its entirety here, but we can look at it like a brief review of the contents, and that can suffice for our purposes. So, among other details, we learn 20 things from this section about the Essenes. So we can look at this list. They reject pleasures as evil, but regard conquests over passions as a virtue. Some of the men reject marriage, while others embrace it. They despise riches. The entire community share ownership of all goods and possessions. They have no city to themselves, but they dwell in every city. They wear white garments. They carry no possessions with them when they travel except for weapons for fear of thieves. When they travel and enter a city, there is an appointed Essene within that city that is to provide for their needs. They pray before the sun rises and work until the 5th hour, which is likely 11 a.m. It's the 5th hour after 6 a.m. That's likely when the day started for them, after which they bathe their bodies as a purification ritual and gather to eat. They avoid swearing oaths unless a new initiate is joining the community. They take great pains to study the writings of the ancients. They use roots and medicinal stones to cure their distempers. I found that to be really interesting, and so far haven't been able to find more information on that. Now, I don't believe that this would be like healing crystals like the New Age uses, but I don't know what constitutes a stone. You know, could salt be considered a medicinal stone and be used for certain things? You know, we don't know. But again, if you look at their theology, I don't think this has anything to do with like the healing crystal kind of garbage that you get from New Age today. If a person wants to join the community, they must spend 3 years proving himself worthy, after which they must swear tremendous oaths, including observing justice towards men, hating the wicked, and preserving the books belonging to their sect. Their judgments are accurate and just. They do not pass sentences by the votes of a court that is fewer than 100. They honor God most of all, but also have great reverence for Moses, so much so that anyone blaspheming against him, against Moses, would be put to death. Many of them lived over the age of 100. They all had extended lifespans compared to the other sects of Jews at the time. They would happily suffer torture or death before they would be coerced into blaspheming God or even Moses. They believed the physical body is corruptible, but the soul is immortal. They are extremely accurate in their foretelling of things to come and almost never miss in their predictions. So we can learn all of that from Josephus. Now, Pliny the Elder, in his work Natural History, gives us a few details and a location of the Essenes, which to many, but not to all, correlates with the location of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Now, again, not everybody agrees with this, because some believe that this community that Pliny the Elder is talking about actually had nothing to do with the Qumran community, and that these are different things. But by and large, you know, modern scholarship, for what it's worth, thinks, believes that these are the same thing, that Pliny the Elder was describing the Qumran community here. So this is still a little up in the air. But Pliny the Elder says, quote, lying on the west of Asphaltites, the sufficiently distant to escape its noxious exhalations, are the Essenae, a people that live apart from the world and marvelous beyond all others throughout the whole earth. For they have no women among them. To sexual desire they are strangers. Money they have none. The palm trees are their only companions. Day after day, however, their numbers are fully recruited by multitudes of strangers that resort to them, driven thither to adopt their usages by the tempests of fortune and wearied with the miseries of life. Thus it is that through thousands of ages, incredible to relate, this people eternally prolongs its existence without a single birth taking place there. So fruitful a source of population to it is that weariness of life which is felt by others. Below this people was formerly the town of Engada, second only to Hierosolima in the fertility of its soil and its groves of palm trees. Now, like it is another heap of ashes. Next to it, we come to Masada, a fortress on a rock not far from Lake Asphaltites, thus much concerning Judea, end quote. Now, again, this scription from Pliny is why most scholars have correlated the Essenes with the Qumran community, but there's not a 100% consensus on this, as others have suggested this correlation is a mistake, even as far as saying the Essenes had nothing to do with the Qumran community. Now, I'm not sure if I fully believe in that. Again, we have to look at the available evidence and kind of decide what makes the most sense to us. Now, lastly, to further complicate this matter, there were different factions of Essenes. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but these different factions each had their own different beliefs. Now, what's really interesting is when we look at the differences in beliefs, it appears at one time all Essenes believed basically the same things, but over time sects within the main group developed, and these sects deviated away from some of the main tenets of the original group, yet they still called themselves Essenes. Sort of like, we have people calling themselves Christian today who we wouldn't really consider as Christian. We would consider them progressives or New Agers or something like that. So to some, these new sects would have been considered heretical when compared against the main group. By the time that Hippolytus of Rome described these different beliefs compared against the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Jewish religion as a whole in chapters 13 through 25 of book 9 of the Refutation of All Heresies, again, you can find that online for free, there were 3 new sects that had branched off from the traditional Essene group. We're given the basic reason for why the Qumran community originally left behind their previous lives in Israel in favor for creating a community in Qumran. The basic reason is that at the time they left, the temple leadership and government had become so corrupt, following ungodly desires rather than the will of God, the true believers in God had no choice but to leave. So they also believed that they were directed to do this by the guidance of the Holy Spirit in order to fulfill the prophecy about being a voice crying in the wilderness that would pave the way for the coming of Messiah. And we actually have a quote here from the community rule from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that explains this. And it says, quote, "And when these became members of the community in Israel, according to all these rules, they shall separate from the habitation of unjust men and shall go into the wilderness to prepare there a way of him, as it is written, prepare in the wilderness the way of, make straight in the desert a path for our God." Isaiah 11:3. This path is the study of the law which he commanded by the hand of Moses, that they may do according to all that has been revealed from age to age, as the prophets have revealed by his Holy Spirit, end quote. And that's actually the community rule. The exact scroll is 1QS8. That's the exact scroll. So you can look that up online, or you can find it in Dead Sea Scroll books that are available and are published today. Now, what immediately comes to mind, what immediately comes to most minds when reading that passage is John the Baptist, followed by the question, was John the Baptist part of the Qumran community? I believe he was, and we have addressed that before in previous episodes, so I don't want to get too much into that. We do have episodes of JPD Weekly that deal directly with John the Baptist, and we will get into it again later, probably sometime after this series. So we will be addressing that. I'm also working on a book right now about all of this stuff. It'll be included in there as well. It'll be published through Defender, so when time comes, it'll probably be later this year, but you'll be able to get that at skywatchtvstore.com. It's not available yet, but will be soon, later this year, I should say. So we'll get into all that in a different episode. But in this series, I want to deal with the rest of the backstory that led to the creation of the Qumran community and the eventual discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in our modern time. So this leads us to the solar calendar of the Qumran community. I want to give a brief introduction of the calendar, and then the way that we're actually going to end this series is to get even more into the prophetic things having to do with the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. Now, an issue that comes up that led to this split between what would be, the future Qumran community and the Pharisees was the change from a solar to a lunar calendar. Now, opinions on the history concerning how all this came about are split, with some assuming it was Antiochus Epiphanes who ordered the change from a solar to a lunar calendar, others saying that it occurred after the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, and at that time a new ruler named Antiochus Eupator came into power and ruled the Seleucid Empire from 164 BC to 161 BC. So some believe that during that time, the Maccabees accepted a deal where the Jews could keep their religion but had to use the Seleucid Empire's calendar. So there's a little bit of there's a little bit of split of opinions on how it happened, but however it may have happened, there clearly was a point when the Jewish leadership accepted use of a lunar calendar where they originally had a solar calendar, and the Qumran believed that to be a grave sin. They believed it so deeply, all throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, they refer to themselves as sons of light, or legitimate priests following the solar calendar, and to those who abandoned the solar calendar as sons of darkness, illegitimate priests following the lunar calendar. And in fact, there was even a prophecy discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls talking about how certain Jews would abandon the solar calendar God gave them in favor of a pagan lunar calendar. Quote, "For there will be those who assuredly make observations of the moon, how it disturbs the seasons and comes in from year to year, 10 days too soon. For this reason, the years will come upon them when they will disturb the order and make an abominable day, the day of testimony, and an unclean day, a feast day, and they will confound all the days, the holy with the unclean, and the unclean day with the holy, for they will go wrong as to the months and Sabbaths and feasts and jubilees. For this reason I command and testify to thee, that thou mayest testify to them. For after thy death thy children will disturb them, so that they will not make the year 364 days only. And for this reason they will go wrong as to the new moons and seasons and Sabbaths and festivals, and they will eat all kinds of blood with all kinds of flesh." So we have that direct quote that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls prophesying this. Now, according to the Qumran community, God commanded that his solar calendar of 364 days must be used to ensure all of the festivals and rituals would be done on the correct day. In the Bible, God took this so seriously that if a priest did not do the rituals exactly as they were supposed to be done, God would strike them dead. Now, even more chillingly, the Talmud records all the high priests up until the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And according to that list, there were 18 high priests in the 400 years of the first temple before the change to a lunar calendar. But during the 420 years of the second temple after the change to a lunar calendar, there were over 300 high priests. And here's a direct quote of that. "The fear of the Lord prolongs days." That is a reference to the first temple, which stood for 410 years and in which only 18 high priests served, as it is written in the lists of the genealogy of the priests in the Bible. "But the years of the wicked shall be shortened." That is a reference to the second temple, which stood for 420 years and in which over 300 high priests served. "But the years of the wicked will be shortened." That is a reference to the second temple, which stood for 420 years and in which over 300 high priests served. End quote. That comes from the Talmud. Now, the theory is that there was such an increase in high priests because, at least in part, they were not doing the rituals and festivals on the correct day, and they kept dying because of it. God kept striking them dead because they weren't doing the rituals on the day that they were supposed to, because they abandoned God's solar calendar and took on a pagan lunar calendar. So this would have contributed to the reasons why the Qumran community would have refused to use the lunar calendar. They wanted to honor God by maintaining use of the correct solar calendar. We talked about the conditions that led to the split between Pharisees, Sadducees, and the sons of Zadok, or the priestly line of Zadok, or the Zadokites, or the Essenes. You know, we talked about how most likely the situation between the Qumran community and Essenes is sort of like that of of the Catholic Church, not in theology, but just in structure, how with the Catholic Church you have the Vatican, you have the leadership at the Vatican, but then you have Catholics dispersed all around the world that follow the leadership of the Vatican. It's sort of like, I believe it's sort of like that with the Essenes and the Qumran community. Now, again, that's not in theology. Theology is totally different. Qumran community theology, Dead Sea Scroll theology is more like Christianity than anything else. But it's just more in structure of the leadership. So you have the priests in the Qumran community that would teach the doctrines of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then Essenes throughout Israel, just general population Jews that followed that line of theology. Those would be called the Essenes, and they followed the Qumran community. We think that's how it was set up. That seems to be what makes the most sense. So where we left off last time, we were talking about some of the things that originally caused the group that would become the Qumran community to break off from the original Jews, the original group, the original nation, the original body of believers in Israel. So there were divisions, Pharisees broke off, and then you had a large group. That larger group split off between Sadducees and then what would become the Qumran community for various reasons. We looked at some of those reasons before in the previous two episodes. We're going to look at some more today, and all of this leads to the creation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the library at Qumran, and how some of those actually include prophetic texts that's not included in our Bible, but the Essenes were known for having extremely accurate prophecy. So they were right about all of the things that they predicted about the first coming of Christ. So wouldn't it make sense that they would be correct in the things that they predict concerning the second coming of Christ? So that kind of is a brief review of what we've already talked about. So where we're going to pick up today is where we left off before, on how what are some of the reasons that caused this group to split off and go to Qumran. So we already talked about some of the doctrinal issues, and we talked about how they used the different calendar. The would-be Qumran community wanted to stick with the original solar calendar because that was how they knew when to do all their rituals and when to do all their sacrifices and festivals and all of that stuff. Whereas the Pharisees and Sadducees in Israel, the leadership, wanted to side with the pagans and use a lunar calendar. And we even saw how that led to there being over 300 high priests during that time because they all kept dying because they were doing the rituals on the wrong days. And that is expressly forbidden in the Bible. There were priests that lost their lives if they didn't do things on exactly the right day where God commanded. But it wasn't just that. There was also acceptance of something called the Oral Torah, and with the Pharisees, and then the Testament of the Patriarchs for the Zadokites. And we talked about how Zadokites, sons of Zadok, Qumran community, those are all kind of talking about the same thing. Those are all terms for the spiritual kind of leadership of that doctrine, of that theology, whereas Essenes are spread around all over Israel, and anybody that follows that are Essenes. Just like the Vatican, the leadership of the Catholic faith at the Vatican, they're Catholic. Technically, they are Catholics, but you would call them, Vatican leadership or priests. You'd have a different name for them, whereas just the general Catholics you would just call Catholics. So it's sort of the same thing. Another way to say it, all priests in the Essene theology would be Essenes, but not all Essenes would be priests or Zadokites, so that might be a better way to look at it. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, you can go back and watch the other two episodes. We got more into depth about that. Okay, let's pick up right where we left off. So along with their refusal to accept the lunar calendar and the Oral Torah as authoritative and on a higher level than just a simple commentary, the soon-to-be Qumran community claimed to have in their possession the testaments of the patriarchs, which was said to be the last will and testaments of every patriarch from Adam to Aaron. And fragments of those have actually been discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, generally speaking, the Qumran community would say that the oral Torah is completely fabricated. And the oral Torah, again, it was this collection that the Pharisees said that interpreted the Torah, but they never wrote it down. They actually didn't write it down until after the destruction in 70 AD of the temple, and then that became the Talmud. So this was like the pre-written Talmud, and the Qumran community, the Zaddokites, completely rejected that. They said that the oral Torah was completely made up. It was fabricated. Now, the Pharisees would have said that the testaments of the patriarchs that they used to exist, but that they were lost throughout time, and the documents that the Qumran community claimed were the testaments were actually fabricated. So there's this kind of dichotomy between these two claims. And we see this back and forth detailed in the Talmud and in the Dead Sea Scrolls both. But of course, they each have their own leanings. Now, much how we Christians today will use the New Testament to help us make sense out of some things in the Old Testament, those who believed in oral Torah would use that to help interpret the books of the Old Testament or the Torah, while those who sided with the Qumran community would have used the testaments of the patriarchs. Now, it's important to note as well that while the Pharisees would have elevated oral Torah to the level of Scripture, the Qumran community apparently did not believe that the testaments of the patriarchs or any of the other Dead Sea Scrolls should be added to what was already recognized as canon. Today what we would call the Old Testament. They didn't call it that, but they did have, a canon. They did have a set of books that was the canon, and then they had other extra things. So this was a large part of the issue. If the Pharisees had considered the oral Torah as just commentary, it probably wouldn't have been as much of an issue for what would be the Qumran community, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are full of commentaries on Old Testament books and passages. However, since the Pharisees elevated the oral Torah to such a degree that it was required to be followed in the same way as the Torah itself, that created an eventual split between the Pharisees and the group that would become the Qumran community. Now, after weighing out both sides of that conundrum today, we would only have to ask ourselves, one would only have to ask himself, who would I believe? Now, if you're interested in my personal opinion, for me personally, it seems too convenient that the Pharisees would have always kept this oral Torah thing from the time of Moses, but never wrote it down until after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, especially when first mention of it comes at a really convenient time in history for the Pharisees. It just seems too convenient at that time in history where they would say, oh, well, actually, it turns out we have this oral Torah thing and we've always had it, but we have it. And so now you all have to listen to what we say and do what we say, and you have to follow what we say just as much as you would follow the Torah itself. It just seems too convenient that right while they were trying to get power over the rest of the population, all of a sudden they have this oral Torah thing. That seems a little too coincidental, a little too convenient for me. It also seems too convenient that those who originally kept and wrote and kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, or their descendants, would have somehow lost all of the testaments of the patriarchs. Because again, that's what the Pharisees claimed. They claimed that they lost the testaments of the patriarchs, and what the Qumran community had and what we're calling testaments of the patriarchs were made up. That seems too convenient to me. Think about it. The testaments of the patriarchs would have been regarded as incredibly important. Again, these would have contained the writings of Adam himself. So when it's obvious, it's also obvious that they knew how to keep copies of documents for extended periods of time. It's literally what they are known for in our modern day, because we have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were so good at this. So it seems unlikely that if they actually lost them, for one thing, it seems unlikely that they lost them at all. I mean, this wasn't just some random letter from from your grandpa or something that you might put in a shoebox and forget about after a couple of years. I mean, this was like literally the last will and testaments of the first human beings, on earth and their descendants leading up to Moses. This would have been so important to them. How on earth could they have lost it when clearly they were not careless about their ancient documents? They kept extremely good care of them. They took very good care of them. So it seems unlikely that they lost them at all. But even if they did lose them, even if they actually lost the testaments of the patriarchs, it also seems unlikely that they would have completely invented new ones and then passed them off as originals, lied like that. Especially when honor, honesty, and abstaining from wickedness was so important throughout their community. It seems unlikely that they would have lied about that. So from the way that and especially because there would be nothing to gain, but from the way that I personally understand it, the Qumran community did not have an incentive to lie, but the Pharisees certainly did. Now, added on to this is the reputation of the Essenes throughout the ancient writings that we already looked at earlier in previous episodes, that, these are coming from historians that were not Essene themselves. And they were saying that the Essenes were regarded, they had this very high opinion of them. They had an excellent reputation. So the reputation of the Essenes throughout the ancient writings that we looked at earlier compared against the reputation of the Pharisees throughout the Gospels. The Pharisees don't have as high of a reputation as the Essenes did. So, of course, that does not mean that every Pharisee was pure evil and every member of the Qumran community was benevolent beyond reproach, nor does it mean that we can say any of this for absolute sure, as we are half a world and 2,000 years removed from this location and time period in human history. But based on the evidence that we have available to us today, personally, I feel comfortable in my own educated guess that most likely the Qumran community were being forthright and honest, and the Pharisees were being completely dishonest. However, again, this is a situation where everyone should look at the available evidence for themselves and come to their own conclusions. It's part of why I'm writing a book on this topic. And again, hopefully that'll be available later this year. Now, this leads to how Rome actually came to rule Israel. This leads us to understanding the conditions of Israel when we arrive at the New Testament, specifically with the reason for Rome's occupation. So, after the Jewish queen, Salome Alexandra, died in 67 BC, her sons, Hyrcanus II, who Salome Alexandra installed as high priest, and Aristobulus, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but so those two sons started a civil war, which greatly devastated Judea. So by 63 BC, there had been constant strife within Israel between the Pharisees, who sided with Hyrcanus, and the Sadducees, who sided with Aristobulus. I don't know. It's a hard name to say. Now, during Passover of that year, 63 BC, Hyrcanus had the Sadducees at the temple attacked. He had them attacked, causing Aristobulus to reach out to a representative of Roman General Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey, General Pompey. Now, at first, Aristobulus was able to gain favor with Pompey, but eventually Pompey sided with Hyrcanus and had Aristobulus arrested. And I think that's the last we'll have to try to pronounce that name. So I think he's out of the picture now. Okay, so good. He was arrested. Now, the Pharisees allowed Pompey to come into Jerusalem. However, the Sadducees were still occupying the temple. So Pompey attacked and was able to take control of the temple. Pompey returned to Rome as the most influential politician of his age. And large parts of Israel were annexed by the Romans. So Judea and Galilee became a client kingdom of Rome at that time because of all that. Now, in 49 BC, civil war broke out in the Roman Empire, and Julius Caesar defeated Pompey. Hyrcanus and an individual named Antipater cooperated with Caesar, and Antipater appointed his son Herod, which should be a familiar name, appointed his son Herod as governor of Galilee. Now, in 43 BC, the nephew of Hyrcanus tried to take the throne, but Herod defeated him and married Hyrcanus's daughter, which put him in line for the throne. Now, by the time Herod became king of Judea, the Jews of all belief systems, so Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, came to hate him. They hated this guy. They despised his transgressions of the Mosaic law, his Greek style of his various building projects throughout Israel, and the fact that he was clearly a Roman king rather than a Jewish one. So they absolutely hated all of that, which caused some strife in Israel for the time. Now, there was actually an Essene prophecy for Herod the Great, and this is a fascinating story. According to Josephus, there was an Essene by the name of Manahem, or Manaheim, let's just say Manahem, who was gifted by God with foreknowledge of the future and spoke a word of prophecy over Herod. Now, remember what we talked about before, that the Essenes were known, according to Josephus, I believe, the Essenes were known to be extremely accurate in their prophecies. Now, apparently by this time, the Pharisees had already started saying that prophecy was done and over with, and that there weren't any more. They basically became cessationists at that time, which is interesting to think about in light of the church today, because we have cessationists today. But the Essenes were basically like, no, there's still prophecy. There's still prophets, and they had accurate prophecies, a lot of which are recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there was actually a prophecy, a word of prophecy spoken of over Herod by this Essene named Manaheim, and Josephus records this. Now, Manaheim once saw Herod as a child going to school, and he saluted him as king of the Jews. Now, at first, Herod thought that Manaheim either confused him with someone else or thought that he was joking, but Manaheim reached out his hand, clapped him on the back, and said, quote, "However that be, thou wilt be king, and wilt begin thy reign happily, for God finds thee worthy of it. And do thou remember the blows that Manaheim hath given thee, as being a signal of the change of thy fortune. And truly this will be the best reasoning for thee, that thou love justice towards men, and piety towards God, and clemency towards thy citizens. Yet do I know how thy whole conduct will be, that thou wilt not be such a one. For thou wilt excel all men in happiness, and obtain an everlasting reputation, but will forget piety and righteousness. And those crimes will not be concealed from God at the conclusion of thy life, when thou wilt find that he will be mindful of them and will punish thee for them." All right, so basically he's saying that, you'll be known as a king, you might start off good, but you're going to get really corrupt and God's going to punish you for it. And Josephus records all of this at the time of the original prophecy for Manahem, that the young Herod had no ambition to be king. Now, however, years later, when Herod did eventually ascend to the throne, he sent out for Manahem and asked how long his reign would be. Manahem answered a bit vaguely, telling Herod, yes, 20 years, nay, 30 years. So a little bit ambiguous, but basically a long time, 20, 30, 40 years, somewhere around there. And while that is kind of vague, that did end up happening. Now, Herod was satisfied with that answer and sent Manahem away. Josephus states that after that, Herod continued to honor the Essenes. So Josephus concludes this account by saying, quote, "We have thought it proper to relate these facts to our readers, how strange soever they be, and declare what hath happened among us." because many of these Essenes have, by their excellent virtue, been thought worthy of this knowledge of divine revelations, end quote. So apparently this was not just the opinion of Josephus, but the Essenes were known for this. They were known for having divine revelations and being correct in their prophecies. Now, apparently the original prophecy did come true. Early on, Herod may have started out decently. However, over time, he became more and more corrupt. He certainly forgot about piety. He certainly forgot about righteousness. And those crimes could definitely be looked at as offensive and punishable by God, as Herod would eventually die of a horrible illness after slaughtering the infants of Bethlehem. And we learn about that from Matthew 2:16 through 18. And he did this in an attempt to destroy the future king of Israel and Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, that is certainly not a good legacy for someone to leave for himself. However, that is what Herod is most remembered for today. Now, it is possible that Manaheim was able to figure this out by studying prophecy rather than by having prophecy revealed to him supernaturally by the Holy Spirit, because according to the book of Gad the seer, and Idumean, which Herod was, and Idumean would be ruling by the time of that the Messiah would come. So the direct quote is, and if you want the book of Gad the seer, you can get that from Dr. Ken Johnson at BibleFacts.org. But the direct quote is, from Seir, Edom, to rule over them, to increase power over and betray a righteous doer. With that document, Gad the seer, if you're not familiar with it, Gad was a prophet during the time of King David, and his book is mentioned in the Bible, but the original text is thought to be lost to time. However, a document that claimed to be a copy of the book Gad the seer was discovered and published in 1786. Now, if that copy is a faithful representation of the original, and if Manaheim had access to the original book of Gad the seer, and if he knew when the Messiah would come from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if he knew when the Messiah would come based on what this other Dead Sea Scroll said that we'll look at later, then he could have used all these things, all these prophecies, to pinpoint exactly who the coming king would be. Now, of course, if we're to believe the words of Josephus and assume that he didn't just make the whole story up, then we still don't know for sure that Manaheim deduced it merely by studying already existing prophecy. It very well could have just been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit. So the method with which he knew this, we don't exactly know, but it had something to do with prophecy. It was either he studied prophecies that were already in existence at the time, or the Holy Spirit just revealed it to him. So what we have looked at throughout this video series so far, it's really only a brief summation of a very exhaustive and interesting history. While there are many other areas that we could have covered, this will give you the background necessary to understanding the rest of the series, what we're going to look at in the next 2 episodes to conclude this 5-part series. So now you know why there was such a drastic change in Israel from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament. Then you also understand the basics of the Qumran community, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees leading up to the time of Jesus. So to put a quick finalization to our historical Pharisee and Sadducee study, we can look at what ended up happening to these groups up to our current time. So the Pharisees ended up becoming what we would call today Orthodox Jews, and there is a lot more that could be said on that. We'll get more into that later, maybe next time. But the Sadducees, now not everyone agrees on this, but it seems that the Sadducees are in existence today as a much smaller group known as Karaite Jews. Now again, not everybody agrees with that, but it seems like that's the case. And the Essenes, it should be obvious now. I don't totally want to ruin the surprise, but it seems obvious now the Essenes became Christians. So, the way that I would explain it, if I was trying to build this up, I would say that I don't want to ruin the surprise just yet, Suffice it to say for now, the Essenes are still very much in existence and active throughout the world. Though today they go by a different name. Chances are you personally know one or two of them. If you're watching this, chances are you are one of them. In short, they became Christians. So we'll spend more time talking about that. And again, I have a book coming out that will map out the amazing spiritual heritage and history of the priestly sons of Zadok who built the Qumran community and the Jewish Essenes who followed them and who later became Christians. So we talked a little bit about how there's some confusion with the term Essenes. So it's sort of like Christians today. At least as much as Christians are today, the Essenes are largely misunderstood as well. I mean, would you agree that Christians, by world standards, are misunderstood today? Of course, the world thinks that we are plenty of things that we are not. Same thing with the Essenes. So most Christians have never heard of the Essenes, which is really unfortunate due to the amazing kinship that we have with them spanning the last 2,000 years and the end of 2 ages, as we will look at a little bit more throughout this series. It's unfortunate, and that's why I wanted to do this series, so we can learn more about our spiritual. We are spiritually descended from these people. These are our spiritual fathers. Now, of those who have heard of this mysterious group, many think of them as like one homogeneous thing. The Essenes were either this or they were that. They were either or rather than both and. And again, this is really similar to how the world views Christianity today. Christians are all one specific thing or another specific thing without much variety, according to the world standards, the way that we're viewed. Now, of course, we know we're not actually like that, but that's how we're viewed. This concept about modern Christianity, it's clearly mistaken, that we're all just one thing, but it's not unique. In fact, it's almost human nature to assume any group is one thing or another instead of adopting a more nuanced understanding. To prove this, try simply entering into Google search, Christians are, or Republicans are, or liberals are, and then allow the search engine to autofill for you what others have previously searched. Chances are you will not receive autofills that say a wide variety of unique individuals who all have a few common beliefs. More than likely you'll get something similar to, you'll get something like negative or cruel or stupid. And those 3 results I actually received when I did this myself, when I put those in. Now, the same misconception can be found in our modern understanding of the Essenes. And this is only the beginning of the commonality between Essenes and Christians today. There were Essenes who believed in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, who lived throughout the various cities of Israel from around the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. However, there were also groups of Gnostics and heretics who existed around the same time and called themselves Essenes. It's sort of like how today, in our modern day, we have modern Christians. There are groups of New Agers calling themselves Christians, and it's sort of the same deal. Throughout history, the Essenes have had heretical groups take on their name, but they didn't maintain true Essene doctrine. So even within the Essene community in Israel, there were at least 3 different factions that broke off from the believing remnant. We made mention of that earlier in the series. We're going to get a little bit more into it, but piecing together works from Josephus and Hippolytus, we learned that there was a faction who believed typically normal things were idol worship, such as, simply carrying a coin was like idol worship to these people because there was a picture of, there was an image on the coin and that image was considered graven to them. Now, there's actually a modern counterpart to this. That could be, those who claim that a Christmas tree is actually idol worship and no Christian should take part in any holidays. That is our modern counterpart to this faction of Essenes that broke off and viewed everything as idol worship. There was a second faction that was violently obsessed with bringing Christian believers back under the law of Moses, especially circumcision, even to the point of slaughtering those who refused. They were called the Circumcision Party. Now, it hasn't gotten that bad quite yet in our modern time, but this could be comparable to modern day hyper Hebrew roots believers who teach that Christians must go back under the law of Moses to be saved. Though admittedly in America, this has not been so bad as to warrant mass death as of yet. It hasn't gotten that bad, but that could be coming. As this apostasy gets worse and worse and worse, because we saw it in the days of the Essenes. So we might see it in the days of Christianity as well. Now, the third faction was very careful about not calling any man Lord or not, being very careful about like names, even under torture or threat of death. Now, at first that sounds reasonable. We should not equate any man with our Lord. However, at the time, Lord was just like any other title, like king or prince. So the belief was to even call an actual Lord by that title would be considered offensive to God, thereby putting a heightened emphasis on the importance of names and titles. So it's sort of similar to those called sacred namers today, those who insist that you must pronounce Jesus' Hebrew name perfectly or he won't hear your prayer. Or he will reject you, or, it's a sign that you don't love him that much, or some ridiculous thing like that. And that you must never actually call somebody by the title rabbi. We've heard that a lot. They're like, whenever I reference, like Rabbi Schneider or Rabbi Jonathan Bernis, without hesitation, there is somebody in the comment section who will say, call no man rabbi, but they're taking the technicality of that verse, and they're not actually looking at what the reason behind it was, what the actual teaching was. And that's the same kinds of things that, like the Pharisees would do and stuff. But this group, this other group, the sacred name group of the Essenes, it's just interesting to me that the Essenes were dealing with very similar offshoots from their believing remnant that we're dealing with today in our believing remnant of Christianity, within the and I'm not talking about like the progressives or, just within our actual believing remnant, that we try to maintain the true beliefs of the Bible. And we don't go off into these weird things like Catholicism or I don't know, like just more liberal, progressive kinds of Christians. That's more comparable to things like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But even within the Essenes themselves, they had these heretical factions that broke off, and they are extremely similar to what we have in Christianity today, with some of these factions breaking off and putting emphasis on these strange things and trying to put that yoke, that burden onto other Christians. The Essenes dealt with the same thing. So we can be encouraged by that because they dealt with it too, but it can also serve as a warning to us that, hey, that happened at the end of the age of Torah, which we'll get into the ages in a moment, but that happened back then. We're seeing a repeat of it today, so let's not fall into that apostasy. Let's not fall into that same thing. So again, it's really interesting that the Essenes were dealing with very similar offshoots from their believing remnant that we're dealing with today in ours. Now, on top of that, there were other divisions, such as those Essenes who abstained from marriage and those who were married, and that's okay. We have Christians that abstain from marriage today and Christians that don't, and it's okay. Even Paul says that, either one is fine. You just do it to honor the Lord. And because of this, anyone could define all of Essenes by any one of these groups. So we did see something like that when we, in the previous sections of this series, of how some of these ancient sources, they would say that, like, they don't marry. They would say something like that. When in fact, those in Qumran may not have married, but general Essenes throughout Israel, a lot of them did. So we see that even in the historical record. You'll have some that say Essenes were celibate. You'll have people today that say, Essenes were mystics or Essenes were vegetarian. Any one of those claims could be technically true about some of them, but not true of the entire group. Just like today, you could make any number of generalized claims about Christians, some of which might be true. If you said Christians are vegetarians, well, you're going to find some Christians who are vegetarians, but that's not necessarily representative of the entire group. And some of those might call themselves Christians, but that's not necessarily a Christian thing. It's not true about all Christians. So for sake of clarity, when Essenes are discussed throughout the rest of the series, we're talking about the remnant of believing Essenes that did not fall in to the heretical factions of, the sacred name stuff or the circumcision party or the hyper idolater, whatever, they would call everything idolatry. When we talk about Essenes, we're not talking about those groups. Those are offshoots. We're not talking about Gnostics or mystics. We're talking about the remnant of the remnant of true believers, the true Essenes. That's who we're talking about. So when we say Essenes, just to clarify, that's who we mean. Now this brings us to the Essene calendar. The first century Essenes had a much different calendar than the Pharisees and Sadducees of their time used. So we talked a little bit about that before, but just for review, according to Essene writing, the Pharisees were using a corrupt pagan lunar calendar, and the Essenes, or the Qumran community, preserved the original solar calendar that God gave to Adam. And even more astonishingly, this was actually prophesied to occur in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We looked at this before, but the Book of Jubilees, which was kept by the Essenes and Qumran, that was kept by the Qumran community, actually states, and this is from Jubilees 6:34 through 35, it actually says this: "And there will be those who will make observations of the moon, for this one, the moon, corrupts the stated times and comes out earlier each year by 10 days. And in this way, they will corrupt the years and will observe a wrong day as the day of testimony and a corrupted festival day. And everyone will mix holy days with unclean ones and unclean with holy, for they will err as to months and Sabbaths and festivals and jubilees." End quote. And so this corrupted calendar of the Pharisees would eventually become the Hillel II calendar in the middle of the 3rd century, or Hillel II, which is what modern Judaism uses today. That's why their calendar is so much different than ours. The Essene calendar, however, is a little bit more difficult to pin down and figure out, as much of what was known about it in ancient times has been lost, only to be rediscovered in around the 90s. Now, Dr. Ken Johnson has done some amazing work with the Dead Sea Scrolls in an effort to restore the Essene calendar, or the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, or the Zadokite calendar, the Sons of Zadok calendar, the Qumran community calendar. As we talked about before, a lot of these terms are kind of synonymous with each other. When we say Essene, we're talking about the general believers, including, the priests in the Qumran community. They would all be Essenes, just like leaders at the Vatican are Catholic, but they're still Catholics out in the world. So, we're kind of using it like that. Not that Catholic doctrine has anything to do with the Essene doctrine. They're very different, but just in structure of how the terms work. Now, what Dr. Ken Johnson has turned up is nothing short of amazing. The Essene calendar is based on the 7-day week. So Saturday is still the Sabbath, making Sunday the 1st, Monday the 2nd, so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing about this, because the sun, moon, and stars were created on the 4th day in the book of Genesis, the Essene calendar has the beginning of every year actually start on a Wednesday. This importance on the 4th day continued through even the early church, as evidenced by some of the writings of the church fathers credited with writing the first commentary. One of the church fathers credited with writing the first commentary in the book of Revelation, Victorinus of Patau. He wrote on the creation of the world, quote, "On the 4th day he made 2 lights in the heaven, the greater and the lesser, that the one might rule over the day, the other over the night," end quote. Well, end quote for him. It's a quote within a quote, but okay. Genesis 1:16 through 17, and then Victorinus continues. "The lights of the sun and the moon, and he placed the rest of the stars in heaven, that they might shine upon the earth, and by their positions distinguish the seasons and years and months and days and hours. Now is manifested the reason of the truth, why the 4th day is called the Tetris, why we fast even to the ninth hour or even to the evening, or why there should be a passing over the even to the next day. Therefore, this world of ours is composed of four elements: fire, water, heaven, and earth. These four elements, therefore, form the quaternion of times or seasons. The sun also and the moon constitute throughout the space of the year 4 seasons of spring, summer, autumn, winter, and these seasons make a quaternion. And to proceed further still from that principle, lo, there are 4 living creatures before God's throne, 4 gospels, 4 rivers flowing in paradise, Genesis 2:10, 4 generations of people from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to Moses, from Moses to Christ the Lord, the Son of God, and the 4 living creatures, these a man, a calf, a lion, an eagle, and 4 rivers, the Pison, Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, the man Christ Jesus, the originator of these things, whereof we have above spoken, was taken prisoner by wicked hands by a quaternion of soldiers. Therefore, on account of his captivity by a quaternion, on account of the majesty of his works, that the seasons also, wholesome to humanity, joyful for the harvest, tranquil for the tempests, may roll on. Therefore, we make the 4th day a station or a supernumerary fast. End quote. So that importance continued on throughout church history. Now, the Essene calendar is a 364-day year that begins on the spring equinox. It is also set up that everything comes out the same every year because 364 days mean the year is exactly 52 weeks with no leftover days, because 52 times 7 is 364. So, for example, Passover on the Essene calendar, on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, Passover is always on the 14th of the Hebrew month Nisan, which is always on a Tuesday. Now, by contrast, the Pharisee and even our Gregorian calendar is imperfect because you can't pinpoint down to the day when a holiday will occur. For example, we can know that Christmas is on December 25th, but every year the day itself might change. So, for example, Christmas in 1998 was on a Friday, while Christmas in 2014 was on a Thursday. So every year it's different. There is even a reference to the 364-day year starting on the spring equinox, when there is an equal amount of day and night in the book of Enoch, which was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book of Enoch is a Dead Sea Scroll. And this is how people like Ken Johnson and others were able to piece together the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, was through things like in Enoch and through other Dead Sea Scrolls. But Enoch 72:32b says, quote, and the night is equal to the day, and the year is exactly as to its days, 364, end quote. Now, what about leap years? Leap years on the Essene calendar are handled differently as well. So our Gregorian calendar has 365 days per year, which generally means every 4 years we add an extra leap day. The modern Jewish calendar only has 354 days per year, meaning once about every 3 years they add a leap month. The Essene calendar maintains the Sabbath cycle, meaning when it becomes 7 days off, they would add a leap week. So this keeps all of the Sabbaths in sync, which was very important for the rituals of the priests, which we discussed earlier. Now, the Essene calendar is also based around the prophetic year of 360 days, such as what is used in the books of Daniel and Revelation. However, to compensate for the fact that an actual Earth year is longer than 360 literal days, the Essenes added, or the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, which is, the calendar is more ancient than the Essenes themselves, but this, according to the Essenes, this would have been the original calendar that like Adam would have used, the first man. But that calendar adds 4 extra days that are called tekufas. A tekufa was always on the 2 solstices and equinoxes of every year, so every 3 months. These were days considered outside of the calendar. So while the new year would technically begin on the spring equinox called Tekufa Nisan on a Tuesday, this day isn't considered the first calendar day of the year. The following day would be. And tekufas are more like place markers or dividers of the 4 seasons. So this is why the first day of the year is actually the day after Tekufa Nisan, which would be Wednesday. The Essene calendar has 12 months of 30 days each. Every season, spring, summer, winter, and fall, is 90 days long. A Tekufa day splits each 90-day season from the following one. So every year, there is a Tekufa Nisan, which is the spring equinox, followed by a 90-day period for spring. Then there's a Tekufa Tammuz, the summer solstice, which then is followed by another 90-day period. Then there's a Tekufa Tishrei, which is the fall equinox, followed by a third 90-day period. Then lastly, a Tekufa Tevet, winter solstice, which is followed by the final 90-day period before the start of the next year. So that's how their calendar worked. Now, this leads us to ages of human history. We talked about how the calendar worked year for year, but actually the entire span of human history works this way. And that includes future ages and things like that. It all works based on the idea of a week, so 7,000 years. So the Essenes had this understanding of the total amount of years of human history from creation all the way up to the new heavens and new earth, the new creation, and how this long time period was to be divided. So the totality of human history, according to the Essenes, would be 7,000 years from the creation itself. So, for example, we learn from Genesis chapter 5 that Adam was 130 years old when his son Seth was born. So for this way of figuring time in years, it doesn't matter how long Adam was in the Garden of Eden or how old he was when he and Eve rebelled or how old they were when they were kicked out of the garden, etc. None of that matters for our purposes here. What actually matters for what we're going to look at is that we know Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. So, according to Essene understanding, Seth was born in the year 130 AM, which stands for Anno Mundi, meaning the year of the world. So instead of having the BC AD system that we currently use, the Essenes counted their years from creation forward. There was no split the way that we have it. We actually do it the confusing way. They had a much simpler method. So if we take the time to actually carefully calculate everything out and working on the assumption that the AM calendar has not been tampered with over time and that certain biblical, extra-biblical, and historical data likewise has not been tampered with, if we do all that, then we can figure the date of creation, which would have been the year 1 AM or Anno Mundi, which technically 1 AM would be a year after creation, since we name years based on how much time has already passed and not on what year is starting out. So, for example, a baby is considered 1 year old a full year after his birth, rather than calling the day that he's born year one. So when a baby is born, we don't say he's a year old. This is year one, even though that's technically the beginning of year one for the baby. The baby's not counted as a year old until that year has passed. So technically, by the year 1 AM, a year would have already passed, but there's no year zero. So there's a little bit of confusion there, and that just relates to how we label things and how we call things. So this would correspond to our year, the first year of creation, 1 Anno Mundi, or just the creation itself, the very first year of creation would actually correspond to our year 3,926 to 3,925 BC. Again, depending on what month and day that we're counting the years, but 3,926 would have been like the day of creation itself. 3,925, that would have been when they say, okay, this is year 1 Anno Mundi, a year has passed of creation. So that, according to our understanding, our calendar, our way of counting years, that's when creation would have happened. So year one would have been 3,925 BC. Now, the 7,000 years of human history were split up into 3 periods of 2,000 years and one final period of 1,000 years, and all of these were called ages. This final 1,000 years was seen as the ultimate Sabbath. And actually, it was believed that God created everything in 7 days to give us an example of his plan for human history. So that final Sabbath, that final 1,000 years was seen as the ultimate Sabbath. That's obviously the millennial reign of Christ. Each age was split into periods of 500 years called onas or unas, and each una was split into 10 periods of 50 years called jubilees. Each jubilee was split into 7 periods of 7 years called shemitahs, and one additional jubilee year. And it's actually interesting because there's a debate right now whether a jubilee is 49 years or 50. And through a lot of figuring out and checking and a lot of things that Ken Johnson has done too, we found out that at least according to the Essenes, a jubilee would be 50 years. So 7 periods of 7 years and then one extra jubilee year. And that 50-year period was a jubilee. So according to the Essenes, all time is understood as subsets. So working from days and up. A year is 364 days. A Shemitah is 7 years. A Jubilee is 7 Shemitahs plus 1 year, or 50 years. An Una is 10 Jubilees, or 500 years. A Millennium is 2 Unas, or 20 Jubilees, or 1,000 years. An age is 2 millennia, or 4 Unas, or 40 Jubilees, or 2,000 years. The last age is a half-length Sabbath, or 1 millennium, or 2 Unas, or 20 Jubilees, or 1,000 years. All of human history is 4 ages, technically 3.5 ages, or 3 ages and 1 millennium, or 7 millennia, or 14 Unas, or 140 Jubilees, or 1,000 Shemitahs, or 7,000 years. That would have been their understanding of all of human history. Now, at the time when I originally started getting into this, which was the end of 2020, so the end of last year, and up until the time of this recording, technically we're in 2021, but according to the Essene calendar, we're in the same year as in 2020 because their year does it at the end of 2020 because their new year doesn't start again for a couple of months. So we're right now at the time of this recording, we're at the end of the year 5945 AM, according to their calendar, meaning in a little more than 4 years, we will be entering into the final jubilee of our current age, which is really exciting. We actually find additional information about these ages by tying together some ancient writings by historians, church fathers, Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Bible. There is an ancient tradition recorded in a Jewish text called the Tana Devei Eliyahu. It is thought to have been written between the 3rd and 10th centuries AD, but when reading through this work, it's clear that things have been added to it throughout the centuries. However, it does seem to preserve a tradition of the general understanding of ages. So it reads, quote, "It was taught in the school of Elijah, the world will endure 6,000 years, 2,000 desolation, 2,000 Torah, 2,000 the Messianic age, but because of our many sins, some of those final 2,000 years have already passed." Now, again, they're looking at this from a viewpoint that says that Messiah hasn't come yet, and they think that that's because of their sins, which in fact Messiah did come, and that third age has begun. Now, of course, again, this being a Jewish source, not a Christian one, that would recognize the Messiah has already come, teaching instead that because of the sins of Israel, God decided to not allow the Messiah to come when he was expected. Because of that, we need help from the Dead Sea Scrolls and Church Fathers to recognize what these ages are and what happened in them. So putting pieces from all these sources together, we learn that the first age was called the age of confusion or desolation or the age of chaos, and lasted from creation to the call of Abraham, the first set of 2,000 years, or 1 a.m. to 2,000 a.m. on a Monday. The second age was the age of Torah, lasting from the time of Abraham, the call of Abraham, to the end of the sacrificial system in 75 A.D. But that would have been the years 2000 a.m. to 4000 a.m. And then the third age is called the age of grace, or the age of Messiah, but the Messianic, the age of grace. It's called that throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you take a certain interpretation. But that starts in 75 A.D., and it ends in 2075 A.D., which would be 4000 a.m. to 6000 a.m. And then finally, the last age is the Messianic Kingdom, or the Kingdom Age, lasting from 2075 A.D. to 3075 A.D., or 6000 a.m. to 7000 a.m. Now, the Church Fathers continued on in this tradition in their writings. The Epistle of Barnabas, written between 70 A.D. and 132 A.D., in chapter 15, verses 4 through 5, says this, quote, "Give heed, children, what this meaneth. He ended in 6 days. He meaneth this, that in 6,000 years the Lord shall bring all things to an end. For the day with him signifieth 1,000 years, and this he himself beareth me witness, saying, Behold, the day of the Lord shall be as 1,000 years. Therefore, children, in 6 days, that is, in 6,000 years, everything shall come to an end. And he rested on the seventh day. This he meaneth, when his Son shall come, and shall abolish the time of the lawless one, and shall judge the ungodly, and shall change the sun and the moon and the stars, then shall he truly rest on the seventh day." End quote. Really interesting. Irenaeus, a Greek bishop who studied under Polycarp, the last living connection to the apostles, because Polycarp studied under John the Revelator himself. So John the Revelator, Polycarp, Irenaeus. Irenaeus said in Against Heresies, Book 5, quote, "For in as many days as this world was made, in so many thousand years shall it be concluded. And for this reason, the scripture says, Thus the heaven and the earth were finished in all their adornment, and God brought to a conclusion upon the sixth day the works that he had made, and God rested upon the seventh day from all his works." Genesis 2:2. "This is an account of the things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come. For the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years." 2 Peter 3:8. "And in 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, that they will come to an end at the 6,000th year." End quote. It is amazing that right now we are only about 54, 55 years away from that. Now, again, we'll get into this a little more later, but we have things like the rapture, and we got a bunch of stuff that still is going to happen in that time. Victorinus of Batau, that we mentioned before, who wrote the oldest known commentary on the book of Revelation around 260 A.D., he wrote, and this is from Revelation 21 through 3, he wrote, quote, "He says the 1,000 years should be completed, that is, what is left of the sixth day, which subsists for 1,000 years," end quote. Now, there's several other church fathers who expressed the belief in the same 7,000-year period of human history, past, present, and future. However, even earlier than the church fathers, we find the Essene calendar referenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls, even in documents that were unique to the Essenes and were never included in the biblical canon. So the Essenes had a surprisingly large number of prophetic predictions in the Dead Sea Scrolls relating to the coming Messiah. They knew that he would be God incarnate, he would die for our sins in 32 A.D., and initiate the coming age of grace. Modern scholarship says that no one knows what happened to the Essenes, that they just vanished in one day. So we even have quotes that say the Essenes disappear from the historical record after the first century CE, because they say Common Era, but that's our AD basically. But when we understand what they believed, what the Essenes believed, and what they were looking forward to, what happened to them is obvious. The believing remnant of Essenes who did not fall into heretical factions that were expecting the Messiah, those believers, when Messiah came, when Jesus came, died, resurrected, ascended into heaven, the Essenes that saw that, they became Christians because they were expecting it, and then went out to preach the gospel to the world. They became us, which is really, really cool. So to show what the Essenes were looking for in the Messiah within the context of their calendar and understanding of ages, we can look at some of the writings that still exist today. So this brings us to some of their prophecy. There's a really interesting document called 11Q Melchizedek, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran caves. This document is believed to have been written around a century before the birth of Jesus Christ, at the latest. It accurately predicts the arrival and death of the coming Messiah right down to the exact year, and uses the Essene calendar and understanding of ages of human history to actually explain it. Now, this is fragmented, but we can look at this and read this. And this is 11Q Melchizedek. This is column 2, verses 2 through 11. And again, it's fragmented, so we can do our best here, but we do get enough information. So it says, and as for what he said, Leviticus 25:13, in this year of Jubilee, you shall return each one to his respective property. Concerning it, he said, Deuteronomy 15:2, this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he lent to his neighbor. He shall not coerce his neighbor or his brother, for it has been proclaimed a release for God. Its interpretation for the last days refers to the captives who something, and whose teachers have been hidden and kept secret, and from the inheritance of Melchizedek for something, and they are an inheritance of Melchizedek, who will make them return, and liberty will be proclaimed for them to free them from the debt of all their iniquities. And this will happen in the first week of the Jubilee, which follows the 9 Jubilees. Okay, we're going to look at that in a minute because that's really interesting. Continuing on. And the Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee, in which atonement shall be made for all the sons of light and for the men of the Lord of Melchizedek over them, according to all their works. For it is the time for the year of grace of Melchizedek and of his armies, the nation of the holy ones of God, of the rule of judgment, as is written about him in the songs of David, who said, Psalm 82:1, Elohim will stand in the assembly of God in the midst of the gods he judges. And about him he said, Psalm 82:2, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. End quote. Now, again, that might be a little difficult to read, but it is written that way because these texts were found in fragments and had to be reconstructed over time. But that aside, what we learn here is, it's stunningly accurate, and it comes across as incredibly Christian, even though this was written no later than 100 BC, 100 years before the birth of Christ. So we first learn that, according to the writer of this text, that the law of Moses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy points to the coming Messiah. The biblical passages that are quoted are interpreted as having to do with the last days, when the Messiah would free the captives from the debt of their iniquities, or in other words, would forgive sinners of their sins. And this would be the last days of their age. And we see that in the Bible too. A lot of times when it says these last days, they're talking about the last days of their age of Torah. They're not necessarily talking about the last days of all. Just like with us, when we talk about the last days, we're talking about the last days of our age of grace. We're not talking about the last days of the millennial reign. So we do the same thing. But anyway, it says here that this will happen, this forgiveness of sins, that the Messiah will come to free the captive from the debt of their sins, that this will happen in the first week, 7 years, of the Jubilee, 50-year period, which follows the 9 Jubilees, and that would be understood as the 9 Jubilees in their Una. So once we have passed 9 Jubilees in the first week of the 10th Jubilee, that's when this is supposed to happen. Now remember, there are 10 Jubilees to a 500-year Una cycle. So they're talking about the Una that they are currently in. And additionally, they were in the final Una of their age. So this 10th Jubilee would have been the final Jubilee of their age, which is so interesting because we are about to enter the final Jubilee of our age. So when we use their calendar, keeping in mind that we already calculated out the beginning of creation to 3,926.25 BC, meaning the beginning of their age would have been in, according to our calendar, it would have been in the year 1926 BC, or 25 BC, depending, again, that year one thing. But we find out that their age would end in 75 AD, using their calendar. So this means that the final Jubilee of their age, or the 10th Jubilee, or the Jubilee which follows the 9 Jubilees, as it says in that prophecy, that began in 25 AD. So now we only have to add the first week that they mentioned, which is a week of years, or a Shemitah, and we actually arrive at 32 AD. Did something happen in 32 AD that resulted in the sins of humanity being forgiven? Of course, the death of Jesus Christ. Death, resurrection, death, burial, resurrection, and even more. It goes on to say that at the end of the 10th Jubilee will begin the year, or the age of grace, and even connects the Messiah with the Elohim who judges in the assembly of God, or the divine council for those familiar with the work of Dr. Michael Heiser. So the true believing Essenes knew the Messiah would be God incarnate, according to this prophetic text written 100 years at least, if not longer, but at least 100 years before the time of Christ. They knew that Messiah would be God incarnate. They knew that he would be coming to forgive the sins of the repentant, those who would actually accept it, by dying and initiating a final age of grace before his triumphal return that begins the millennial reign. Isn't this amazing? Because we're always taught that nobody knew, nobody knew what the Messiah would be, or who it would be, or everybody got it wrong. Nobody knew how to interpret those prophecies. Wrong. The Essenes, the Qumran community knew, and they wrote about it. And we have access to those in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They knew exactly who to look for and exactly when. So they were clearly being guided by the Holy Spirit. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And this is never really talked about because most people don't know about it. But that's why we're doing this series, because every Christian should know about this. I mean, it's phenomenal. Now, lastly, it becomes obvious that the apostles and even Jesus himself held to this understanding of ages. With this context, it can help us make sense of passages that are often misunderstood and become objects of arguments and, sometimes even animosity among believers. So Matthew 24:3 says, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" Which age were they talking about? See? End of the age isn't just the end of all creation or the end of the world. It's the end of their age, or they're speaking of specific ages here. 2 Peter 3:8. "But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day." Because again, they had this understanding that all of human history would be 7,000 years. It's right there in our Bible. Matthew 13:39 through 40 says, "The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burnt in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age." Now, when it says this age, it's speaking of the age that this harvest was going to would happen, which is the age of grace, which is the age that we are in now. So that's absolutely amazing. Matthew 13:49 says, "So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just." And that is clearly speaking of the end of the age to come, the end of the age of grace, the end of the age that we are in right now. Matthew 28:19 through 20 says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Amen. Hebrews 9:26 says, "He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world, but now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." Amazing. So when we get all this age, this end of the age terminology, now we can finally know what they're talking about. And it doesn't have to be so confusing anymore. Ages were a real thing that they actually understood as being periods of 2,000 years within human history. So it's so interesting to read through those with that question in mind. Are they talking about the end of their age or the end of our age or the end of all ages? One passage that talks about the transition from the previous age of Torah to our age of grace can be found in the letters of Paul. 1 Corinthians 10:6-11 says, "Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." It states that what happened to those who didn't obey God was for an example and as a warning to whom the end of ages has come. Paul was writing from his own perspective as a convert to Christianity, originally from the end of the age of Torah, getting ready to enter into the age of grace. So we as Christians today, we find ourselves in a similar position to Paul. If the Essene calendar is correct, we as Christians living in the end of the age of grace, getting ready to see the return of our Lord Jesus Christ, we as Christians will be able to usher in the final kingdom age. And according to the Qumran community, according to the Essenes, according to the Zadokite calendar, the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, that transition is set to occur in 2075. Actually, that transition is going to occur within that final Jubilee, as we saw in the beginning of the church age, end of the age of Torah. Jesus came and died in 32 AD. So that was around about, that was within that final 50 years, that final Jubilee. The end of the age didn't technically happen until 75 AD. It's amazing to think about that those Essenes who were witnessing the transition of the end of their age into the beginning of the next, we right now as Christians are in that same position. We are witnessing the end of our age and the beginning of the next. And that to me is so inspiring and motivating. They split up all of human history into 7,000 years. They understood each 1,000-year period as like a day of a week. And the entire human history is like 1 week of millennia, 1 week of thousands of years. Each age is 2,000 years long. So from creation to the call of Adam, or the call of Abraham, that is called the age of chaos. From the call of Abraham up until 75 AD, that is the age of Torah. And then from 75 AD up until 2075 AD is the age of grace, according to them. And then after that is the 1,000-year Sabbath, the millennial reign of Christ. Now, we can't put an exact date. We can't put an exact date on any of these because there's a transition period between the ages. Technically the end of the age of Torah was in 75 AD, and that was the beginning of the age of grace. But we still had the age of grace bleeding through from about like 30 AD. The ministry of Jesus, that's what it was about, salvation. His death happened in 32 AD, burial, resurrection, all that stuff. So you clearly had, for that 50-year period, you had Christians, you had the age of grace being set up. So we could expect something like that to happen as well. I mean, we saw that in the last transition of the age. Call of Abraham. It's the age of Torah, but you don't get the Torah till much later. You get the call of Abraham. You get his lineage, Israel. You get all that stuff, but you don't even get the Torah for a while. So there's a transition period between these ages. So we should expect a transition period as well, which means that our final Jubilee should be prophetically significant. And we are about to enter into that. And what can we expect in coming years? What is our final Jubilee going to look like? And the best that we have available is what the ends of the last ages looked like. There was severe apostasy in every single one of them, so we should expect that. And we are seeing that. But this helps explain, too, why there's so many Christians against Christians. There's a lot of infighting in Christianity. You had the same thing at the end of the last age. There was a lot of infighting, certainly of Jews in Israel, but also among the Essenes. There were these break-off factions, these heretical Essenes that did not maintain proper Essene doctrine. They kind of made up their own stuff, but they still called themselves Essene. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Sorry, I'm moving around a lot. I just got a new office chair, and I'm still trying to get used to it. I have a cushion on it that keeps moving around. All right, anyway. But we see that in our own day. We have all these break-off factions of Christians that still call themselves Christians, but they want to focus on calling holidays pagan or saying that everything you do is idolatry, or saying that if you don't pronounce the name of God correctly, he won't hear you, and just these weird things. But what's strange about it is the Essenes had those exact same things within their groups, within their believing remnant. They had those same exact factions branch off. You had a hyper-Hebrew roots. You had what was called the circumcision party, which was trying to force people under the law, again, saying that that's how you get saved. There was a faction of that. There was a faction of sacred namers. There was a faction of people that wouldn't even carry around coins because they said it was idolatry to just carry a coin because it had a picture of somebody's face on it. So there was all of that stuff. And it's funny that we see the exact same things in our remnant of believing Christianity. We see the same things because the enemy doesn't have any original ideas. Same thing happened over and over again. There's nothing new under the sun. So we know that we can expect that kind of stuff because that is what the last age, the end of the last age looked like. And we also talked about how the final Jubilee of our age starts in the year 2025. So we just got about 4 years. Now, that doesn't mean nothing will happen in those 4 years. A lot still could happen. We have a lot that could happen. And there is still a lot of prophecy that needs to be fulfilled. So we have that whole 50-year period. Now, the interesting thing is the final 7-year tribulation. We don't know when in that final Jubilee that 7 years is going to happen. Now, yes, God could surprise us all, and we might not even see the tribulation until well after 2075. God can do whatever he wants. But if we follow the patterns that have already happened, and if we believe that God's going to be consistent with that, and if we believe that the Dead Sea Scroll calendar is accurate, that the Essenes had an accurate knowledge of ages, and if all of that is right, if we assume all that is right, then sometime within the next 54 years, we should see all of the rest of prophecy up to the point of the return of Christ be fulfilled, which is really exciting. So that would include a rapture of the church at some point, which that could happen at any time. We have that. We have the 7-year tribulation, which that could happen at any time too. The 7-year tribulation would not have to start at the end of the final Jubilee because, again, when Christ came and died, that did not happen at the final Jubilee, the final, and in 75 AD. It happened well before that. So we could see the same kinds of things happen because there's a transition period, and these dates, these years that determine the beginning and end of an age, they don't necessarily correlate with all of the events that are supposed to happen. It's not a hard exact date. It's more of a season. You could think of it like that. So we're entering into that season now. So what can we expect? In just around 4 short years, we will be entering into the final jubilee of our age, according to the Essenes, the final age before the return of Christ. Now, of course, we don't want to become overly excited and begin setting definite dates. We don't want to do that. Speculation and wondering what if, that's one thing, but we can fall into serious error if we begin stating as a fact that something like the rapture of the church will occur on an exact date. In fact, Jesus tells us himself, and it depends on your interpretation of this, but Mark 13:32-37 says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch." Now, there's been a lot of discussion about that within the church as to what Jesus was referring to here. I'm of the personal belief that this is actually referring to the second coming of Christ and not the rapture. And I did a whole episode of JPD Weekly on that about 6 weeks ago. So you can go and look at that. And it's just going through Matthew 24 and 25 and showing how this all has to do with Israel and not the church. But there are some that say that this is the rapture. And the overall message here to those people is this time is a mystery, that this day and hour cannot be known. The angels in heaven haven't figured out Jesus at this point, that he said it hasn't figured it out, but only the Father. Now, those who believe that this is the rapture would say that we know specific day calculations from the books of Revelation and Daniel that tell us how long after certain events, such as the abomination of desolation, right down to the day that we can expect to see the end of the Great Tribulation and the return of Jesus. So we can actually time these things out once something happens, once a confirmation of the covenant happens. Also, with the ancient understanding of ages, it would seem they would be able to assume Jesus would be returning in 2075 AD. So that's why some people say that can't be referring to the second coming, but it has to be referring to the rapture. Now, I would disagree on that because Jesus, refers to it as the time of the days of Noah. Well, in Noah's day, God told Noah that there would be 120 years before the flood, right? And Noah knew that, and it says that he was a preacher of righteousness, so he tried to warn people. Nobody listened. But then it says also that nobody was aware. Like nobody knew until the rain fell. It says that in the New Testament. I believe in maybe 2 Peter or Jude or one of those. But it says in the New Testament that nobody knew. So, well, clearly, knowing doesn't seem to be about knowledge. It seems to be about acceptance of the knowledge. So Noah would have been saying this, we would imagine, that there's 120 years left to get right with God. Come on, the rain's coming, and nobody believed him. And that's what not knowing means, that it wasn't believed. Well, in the same way, I think that the coming of Christ, yes, it can be like known, but the people of the earth aren't going to be believing it. And I think that that's the whole point. So I don't think that it's the rapture, but a lot of people do think it's the rapture. Because they'll say like, well, the rapture is you can't predict it, and that's why Jesus didn't even know, and that's why nobody knows. Whereas you could conceivably predict the second coming of Christ if you knew when the, after the confirmation of the covenant of the Antichrist, and, you could time it then. But the idea, I think, is that nobody really is going to do that. There will be some believers that will, but the world by and large won't. If that's teaching of the bodily return of Jesus to the planet Earth, people who say that this is the rapture, they would say that there would be a point in the future where that verse wouldn't be true anymore, where people would know the day and the hour, rendering void the teaching about being watchful. That could be true. God can certainly do anything he wishes. But there's another event that is said to occur at any moment from the time of the apostles to the time of Jesus' bodily return. and that's the rapture. So they would say that verse has to do with the rapture. I used to think that, but I don't think that anymore. I think that verse has to do with the second coming. Anyway, but this is not something that we as believers in Christ need to become dogmatic about and divide over. We do know that Christ is going to return someday, and if you believe in a pre-trib rapture, then you believe that the rapture of the church is imminent. It could happen at any time. So all that aside, whether one believes that specific verse is talking about the rapture or not, most Christians who believe in any kind of rapture, pre, mid, or post, would agree that we cannot know the timing of it for absolute sure. The best that we can do is speculate and wonder. Now, I absolutely plan on doing just that here. But it's important to keep in mind that, I'm not saying that this absolutely will play out in the ways that I'm going to describe as possibilities. I'm only offering it as possibilities. If the past speculations of many other researchers concerning the timing of the rapture are any indication, then the safest bet is to assume that the timeline I'm going to provide as an example of how it could pan out is wrong. That is the safest bet. It seems like whenever people really try to pin this stuff down and try to predict it, they're wrong. So we have to assume that that could very well be the case still. So hold on to it loosely. Don't build a new denomination over it. But there's always that part of us that wants to ask, what if? So how could all of this plan out? Well, again, we only need look at the final jubilee of the previous age. The Essene calendar absolutely does put an exact year as the end of one age and the beginning of the next. However, prophetic events that are supposed to happen around this time do not always work out so precisely. So the beginning of one age tends to bleed into the end of the previous age. So this bleeding through of ages tends to occur within the final jubilee of an age. So it's almost as if the old age is winding down, getting tired, and the new age is so excited to begin, it begins preparing a little bit earlier than its exact starting date. You can actually think of this in terms of a relay race, which is really interesting when we think about Paul's words about winning the race, running the race, all that stuff. But think of a relay race where team members cover equal distances, but they each take turns. When it is one member's turn, he carries a baton. Now, after his turn is finished, he hands off the baton to the next runner. But what happens during that handing off period, at the end of one runner's time and the beginning of the next, both runners are actually running together holding the baton. And during that pass-off, they're both running together at the same time in a marked exchange zone. It's part of how the relay race works. Ages work exactly like that. The marked exchange zone of ages is the final jubilee of the age that's about to end. Now, in 2025 AD, if the Essene calendar is correct, we will enter into the marked exchange zone of our age and the kingdom age. So what an exciting time to be alive, right? We see many examples of this when we consider how the age of Torah ended and the age of grace began between the years 25 AD and 75 AD. So as Christians, we would all agree that the church really started with Jesus, obviously. Some would say it began at the birth of Jesus because there was finally a Messiah on earth for people to accept. Others would say it occurred at the start of or possibly sometime during his 3.5-year ministry. Others would say that it started at his death or his resurrection or his ascension or at Pentecost with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. All of these things have three things in common. First, they all contributed to the start of the church. Second, they all were the main prophecies that those living in that age were looking for. And third, they all occurred before the technical end of the age in 75 AD. Now, we must remember when we say that an age begins on a certain year, we're talking about an exact number for that year, that by the time of this exact year, everything that needs to be in place for the operation of the next age should be in place. So that would be the end of that exchange zone. It's like if I were to say that I was going to have a birthday party at 3 p.m. this Friday, and there's going to be cake and presents and games and some live performances and all this stuff. Well, what that means is that by that exact time, 3 p.m. on Friday, by that exact date, at that exact time, all of those things will already be in place. It doesn't mean I'm going to do all those things right at that time. There's a time of preparation. So 3 p.m. Friday is the cutoff date where all this stuff has to be done for this party. So on Tuesday, I might hire the live performers. Wednesday, I could start buying all of the presents. Thursday, I could have all the games delivered. Friday at noon, I could pick up the cake and have the performers start to arrive. Then finally, between 1 p.m. and say 2:45 p.m. on Friday, I might make sure everything is together and go through my final checklist before people start arriving. So if everything goes to plan, then technically the party starts at 3 p.m. on Friday. But a lot of things were changing and coming to pass to prepare for it since last Tuesday. So it's the same thing with these ages. By the time of 75 AD, everything should have been in place without anything else left to officially start the church age. The Messiah had to be born, teach, die, resurrect, and ascend. The Holy Spirit had to come. The temple in Jerusalem had to be destroyed, and the sacrificial system had to finally be done away with. Then and only then would all of those prophecies be fulfilled. When all those prophecies were fulfilled, only then could the age of grace, or the church age, officially begin. That leads us to wonder, what was the final thing that occurred in 75 AD? Well, we all have at least a basic understanding of the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed in 70 AD. But what occurred 5 years later? There's actually some really interesting history here. So while the destruction of the Jerusalem temple definitely dealt a massive blow against the sacrificial system of the Pharisees, it didn't yet completely demolish it. There was actually another Jewish temple in Egypt that was destroyed by the Romans in 73 AD. And then finally, the final nail in the coffin of the Pharisaical sacrificial system was hammered when a new type of Sanhedrin was established in Yavne that decided prayer rather than sacrifice was sufficient. The reestablishment was the beginning of modern rabbinic Judaism. It was the official end of the sacrificial system, and that happened in 75 AD. Now, according to some sources, the final president of the old Sanhedrin, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, died, and the first president of the new reestablished Sanhedrin, Gamaliel II of Yavne, officially began his duties in exactly 75 AD, according to some sources. Now, if that's true, that means that by the year 75 AD, everything was in place for the age of grace to officially begin, because the sacrificial system was done away with, like officially, for sure, done. Now, we can assume that the same would be true for the end of our age of grace. If the Essene calendar is correct, then by the year 2075 AD, everything should be in place for the millennial reign of Christ to begin. This means that all of the prophecies should already be fulfilled. Not only everything having to do with the 7-year tribulation, but also the return of Jesus, the judgment of the Antichrist, judgment of the false prophet, everyone who took the mark of the beast, Revelation 19:20, but the binding of Satan in the abyss, Revelation 20 verse 2, rewards of the righteous being received, 1 Corinthians 3:12 through 15, and Revelation 20 verse 4, the establishment of Jesus' rule in Jerusalem, Jeremiah 3:17, Zechariah 14:9, putting in place how everything will work with the nations of the world during this time, Zechariah 14:16 through 19, and everything else, so that in 2075, everything will be in order, everything will be set in place for the kingdom age to officially begin, without anything left to do except enjoy the next 1,000 years. So all the nations should already know what to do. Everybody should already understand the way that everything is going to happen in the next age. Now, we don't know how long that's going to take. There's still a large number of prophecies that must be fulfilled prior to the kingdom age. And think about it like this. how long did it take for everybody to kind of understand how the church age was going to work? Well, apparently it took right around 50 years. It took from the time, or 40 years. It took around the time that Christ, had his ministry, and then it took many, many years after that until 75 AD till everybody kind of knew what to do. Now, are we going to see the same thing in the kingdom age? How long is it going to take after Jesus returns to explain to everybody in the world how this new age is going to work? Because we know, due to Old Testament prophecies that foretell the coming kingdom age, we know that if nations don't go and celebrate certain festivals, that they're not going to get rain. So I mean, how is all this going to get explained to everybody, and how long is that going to take? So the point is, we might not have to wait till 2068 to get a 7-year tribulation. We could have a 7-year tribulation much before that, and there could be a period of time after Jesus returns where we're all just setting up the kingdom. We're all setting it up and waiting. We're beating our swords into plowshares. That might take some time. Now, and maybe not. It could be that 2068 AD is when the 7-year tribulation is going to start, or it could be in the year 4000. We don't know for sure. But there is still a large number of prophecies that must be fulfilled prior to the kingdom age, but many of those concern the 7-year tribulation period. We also have a possible rapture and the events after the tribulation, to deal with. And it's important to know exactly where to place these things in terms of exact dates along the prophetic timeline. But we can look for patterns shown to us from the end of the previous age of Torah. We can look at those patterns to see when these things might take place. If Jesus came the first time relatively early in the final Jubilee of the age of Torah, is it reasonable to assume he might return early in the final Jubilee of our age of grace? Could the church age actually be 2,000 years as well? If the church age, if the church started in like 32 AD or something, might we only have to wait till 32 AD for Jesus to return? Who knows? So, this brings up some possible end times timelines. And we can piece a few things together and speculate about a possible return of Jesus to use as an example of how the rest of end times prophecy could be fulfilled. Now, in looking at this timeline, keep in mind, this is only hypothetical, all right? And it involves a lot of assumptions, many assumptions. Assuming the Essene calendar is correct, assuming that it hasn't been tampered with and that we understand it correctly today and we're calculating the years correctly, etc. A lot of assumptions. So don't build a new doctrine on this. Don't build a new denomination. We don't want to get too excited like that. If it doesn't happen this way, we don't want to get discouraged. It is at best a guess and most likely an incorrect one. If we're being totally honest, most likely this is an incorrect guess, because everybody who has ever tried to predict these kinds of things, when things are going to start, they've all been wrong. So I'm nobody special, all right? But it's still just kind of fun to think about. So we have to keep that in mind. Literally 100% of people who have tried to predict the rapture, who have tried to predict the year of the beginning of the tribulation, have been wrong. 100% of them. So what is presented here, what is presented next to close out this series, it's not a prediction. It is only a possibility. I want to make that incredibly, incredibly clear, because it's still fun to think about. And as long as we're not hinging our faith on it and we just see it for what it is, a possibility, I think it can be really interesting and beneficial even to consider some of these possibilities. So all that said, we believe that the final Jubilee of our age begins in 2025 AD. Now, interestingly enough, and we've talked about this in other episodes, but NASA has actually predicted 3 dates for the asteroid named Apophis to fly by the Earth. Some have wondered if Apophis is actually wormwood, and if these flyby dates if one of them might be a strike and fulfilling the wormwood prophecy in the book of Revelation. These 3 dates that Apophis is supposed to fly by the earth are all in the spring of the year, which is interesting because the spring is what starts a year according to the Essene calendar. It begins the year, but they're all in the spring of the years 2029, 2036, and 2068. Now, a possible connection, again, between Apophis and between the Apophis asteroid and the wormwood prophecy of the book of Revelation has been well established in the past. Dr. Tom Horn has written about that in his books, The Wormwood Prophecy and The Messenger. And it's also believed that an Apophis wormwood asteroid strike could tie some of the trumpet judgments of Revelation together into a chain reaction type of thing caused by a single event, and could possibly occur in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. Possibly. Now, lastly, while NASA is saying that a 2029 strike of Apophis is extremely unlikely, they have recently admitted that there is an unexpected acceleration of the asteroid due to what's called the Yarkovsky effect. It's basically the way that sunlight shines off of an asteroid. It can alter its speed and trajectory and things. So NASA is saying that a 2068 strike is more likely. Due to this acceleration, but is still maintaining that 2029 is unlikely. However, we don't know what could change within the next few years, and we don't know for sure that NASA would tell us if a strike was imminent. We don't really know. So let's just say hypothetically that the Apophis asteroid does strike Earth on Friday, April 13th, 2029. That's the date that NASA currently predicts for when Apophis will be closest to the Earth. So let's say hypothetically that it's not just close to the Earth, it strikes. And it is, in fact, the fulfillment of the wormwood prophecy. Let's say, just hypothetically, that all that's true. Now, amazingly, and let's say that happens in the middle of the tribulation as well. I think Tom Horn has laid out a pretty interesting case that's when it's going to happen, right in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. So let's say hypothetically all of that is true. Now, amazingly, when you subtract 3.5 years from the spring of 2029, you arrive at the time of Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets, in 2025. Rosh Hashanah is a 2-day celebration that is commonly associated by some with the rapture of the church among Christians. Now, I do want to point out that this is based on Israel's calendar. So there are others that would say the church has nothing to do with Israel's calendar because the church is a separate program than the program of Israel, according to God. So we can't really predict church things, like the rapture, based on Israel's calendar. So that's important to understand as well. And I actually am kind of leaning in that direction myself. So I don't know if Feast of Trumpets would have anything to do with the rapture or not. Possibly not. It might have something else to do with Israel specifically. But still, there are a lot of people that believe that I could be wrong on that. A lot of people do believe that the Feast of Trumpets will have something to do with the rapture, because it's a 2-day celebration. You can't know the day or the hour, but again, like I said in that previous verse, I don't believe that that's talking about the rapture. I think that's talking about the second coming of Christ. So there's several possibilities here. There's a lot of things we don't know, and there's a lot of differences of opinion. But there are people who believe that Feast of Trumpets, that the rapture is going to happen on the Feast of Trumpets sometime in some year. Now, this is especially interesting when we consider that, again, 3.5 years before that date of 2029 of the Apophis flyby and possible wormwood strike, if that is to occur. That is interesting that 3.5 years before that is the Feast of Trumpets. Could the rapture happen then? Maybe. Now, Rosh Hashanah, again, it's a 2-day celebration commonly associated with the rapture of the church among Christians. That is especially interesting when considering Jesus' words about not knowing the day or the hour. If that means the rapture, I don't necessarily think it does, but I could be wrong. Now, if the rapture was to take place on the Feast of Trumpets, there'd be no way to know and if that is, there'd be no way to know the exact day or hour since the celebration takes place over the course of 2 days. So the idea is maybe that's a hint. Okay, maybe. Now, if we use the Essene calendar, we discover that the Feast of Trumpets in 2025 occurs on September 16th through 17th. And we also know that the rapture is not the event that officially starts the 7-year tribulation. As the book of Daniel states, Daniel 9:27a, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Now, this is referring to a week of years, or a Shemitah that we talked about before, a 7-year period. This confirmation of the covenant with many is what officially starts the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, not the rapture. The rapture can happen at any time. So if we assume that the middle of the tribulation is April 13th, 2029, we can subtract 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, or 42 months, or time times and half a time, according to biblical prophecies such as Daniel and Revelation. That actually has more to do with Moedim cycles, festival cycles, but still, we can subtract that, and we can actually come to the date November 1st, 2025, as a possible date that the Antichrist confirms the covenant, whatever that is. November 1st, 2025. Now, interestingly, on the Essene calendar, that date is Sheshvan 16 on the Essene calendar. The Dead Sea Scroll calendar, which actually, if you want to look up dates on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, just go to dsscalendar.org. But it's Sheshvan 16, which is only 1 day before Sheshvan 17, the date when the flood of Noah began. Isn't that amazing? So in the days of Noah, the last day before the rain would have been Sheshvan 16, where people still would have been saying peace and safety. Now, isn't that interesting that the day, if November 1st is the day that the Antichrist confirms the covenant, on that day, people are saying peace and safety, and that's the actual final day that there's going to be any peace and safety. Now, it could work out that way. So, again, Sheshvan 17, the day when the flood of Noah began. So in Noah's time, Sheshvan 16 was the final date the rebellious inhabitants of the world had of blissful ignorance, believing they were safe and at peace. Again, remember 1 Thessalonians 5:3 says, while people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Now, after that confirmation of the covenant, the middle of the tribulation comes. Now, if we are to assume that Apophis is wormwood and strikes on April 13th, 2029, and this is the middle of the tribulation, then we find some interesting facts about this day. First, according to the Essene calendar, April 13th, 2029, again, that is the date of this flyby, that is 10 days after Passover, Nisan 14, on the calendar, on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, date of Nisan 24. Now, first, according to Daniel 10, 4 and 5, the prophet Daniel was visited by the angel on Nisan 24. Also, in 1312 BC, on Nisan 14, a very interesting thing happened to the children of Israel after crossing the Red Sea. So, again, keep this in mind, because this is mind-blowing. Exodus 15, 22 through 23 says, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. When we compare that, bitter water, when we compare that with the description of wormwood in the book of Revelation, Revelation 8, 10 through 11 says, then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Both passages mention the number 3, and most astonishingly, both mention bitter water. So in the passage of Exodus, when they were traveling for 3 days without water, that would mean that sometime after the 3 days, but before the 4th, so around the halfway point perhaps, maybe the 3.5 day, is when they found the bitter water. Could it be that the children of Israel found the bitter water 3.5 days after their exodus from Egypt, just as the world finds their bitter water 3.5 or so years after the church makes their exodus from the world in the rapture? Is that possible? Now, and again, we looked at the dates and the November and then the 10-day difference there, and we looked at all that. So, rapture of the church. Then shortly after, you have the confirming of the covenant, which starts the tribulation. 3.5 years into that, you have the bitter waters of wormwood. Just like 3.5 days, the children of Israel found Mara, the bitter waters there. I don't know if that's just a coincidence. That seems pretty amazing. Now, there's even more. There's even more stuff like this. If we add 1260 days, 1,260 days, as stated in the book of Daniel, to April 13th, 2029, so we add, because again, if that's the halfway point, so we'll add another 3.5 years, 1,260 days, we come right to September 24th, 2032, which on the Essene calendar is the Day of Atonement. Jesus died in 32 AD and fulfilled all of the spring feasts, all the spring festivals. Wouldn't it be interesting if Jesus came back right where he left off, only exactly 2,000 years later, to fulfill the fall feasts right at the same point that he left? Wouldn't that be interesting? Now, if we continue on with that, Daniel's prophecy also gives us 1,290 days and 1,335 days from the middle of the tribulation that we have to deal with. Now, 1,290 days after April 13th, 2029 is October 4th, 2032, which is Sheshvan 10, and that is the day that Noah entered the ark and the day before Methuselah died. So this is clearly a great day of judgment from the Lord, and based on the wording of Daniel 12, could be the day the image of the beast is removed. Daniel 12:11 says, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, next we have 1,335 days that we mentioned before. Daniel 12:12 said, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Now, according to our timeline, 1,335 days after April 13th, 2029 is December 8th, 2032, which actually is the first day of Hanukkah. Is it just a coincidence that all these dates are lining up on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar? That's actually the first day of Hanukkah. Now, what's really interesting about that is what we talked about a few videos ago in this series, that Hanukkah is 70 days exactly after the Feast of Tabernacles, and the book of Maccabees says that Hanukkah is actually modeled after Tabernacles and is considered a delay of Tabernacles. Hanukkah was created due to a reaction of the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, a historical event that Jesus uses to point out the future Antichrist and abomination of desolation. Matthew 24:15-16 says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. To put this in our timeline, we know that just before the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the first resurrection occurs. That's Revelation 24-6, and this is probably when believers will receive their rewards. Possibly. That also could happen after the rapture during the tribulation when we're up in heaven with Christ. But it could happen after. That's 1 Corinthians 3:12. We also know that there have been a lot of believers throughout time, and we have no idea how long it'll take for us all to have our turn standing before Jesus and receiving our reward. It's possible that this all happens in an instant. We tend to think of it like that, but it seems more likely that Jesus will work within the physical dimension of time as it's been created to work, because he's created it like that and he's always used it, to fulfill all the other prophecies. So it seems like that would still be the case, at least until the new heavens and new earth. Now, if that's the case and Jesus returns in 32 AD, maybe it takes just over 40 years to get through every believer's meeting for rewards, for nations to beat their swords into plowshares, Isaiah 2:2-4, and for everyone left in the world to establish and learn the new way of doing things under the rule of Jesus Christ. Especially considering the massive final end times battle of Armageddon, it seems reasonable to expect some time for cleanup. so that in 2075 AD, the kingdom age can officially begin with nothing left to be fulfilled. So maybe it takes time for all the cleanup of the world, and it takes time for that. Now, finally, we come to the end of the millennial reign in our hypothetical prophetic timeline here. The interesting thing is, even here, we see a little bit of bleeding over between ages. Just before the end of the kingdom age and before the beginning of the new heavens and new earth. So before the end, just before, for a little while, before the end of the kingdom age, Satan is let loose to instill another apostasy and war, just like we saw at the end of all the other ages. So Revelation 20:7 through 10 says, "And when the 1,000 years were ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Now, this is how the totality of the 7,000 years of creation history finally ends before the new heavens and new earth described in Revelation 21. And it's interesting that we still have that bleed over. We see a bit of the bleeding over, the relay race model after the millennial reign as well. So just before everything comes to a close, in that bleeding over, possibly in the final jubilee of the kingdom age, of the millennial reign, we see Satan let loose, then finally destroyed, and the great white throne judgment of Revelation 20:11 through 15. If we had to guess, and if the previous ages are any indication of how we could date these things out, we should expect Satan to be let loose in the final jubilee of the kingdom age. So somewhere around 3025, 3032, somewhere around there. That final 50 years, maybe even exactly 1,000 years from the day he was originally bound, which would mean he would see his release in that model, if that timeline is correct, in 3032 AD. Now, if this is the case and following that pattern, we could even predict or guess the time of the final day of creation as we know it. We should expect the final day to be mid-March, possibly on Adar 28, which is the Saturday before the new year, or perhaps Tekufa Nisan 3075, the day just before the first day of the new year on the Essene calendar. And that'll actually be a Tuesday. Or maybe how God used every day in the first week of existence to create everything. Maybe he will use every day of the final week to pass everything away, ending on Friday, Nisan 3rd, 3075. Then, presumably, when all of creation is exactly 7,000 years old, Revelation 21 and 22 will be fulfilled. The old heavens and earth will pass away, meaning either be removed or die, or both when you look into the original Greek. And a new heaven and new earth will be perfectly created without sin, pain, or death, exactly as it was always intended to be from the beginning. So finally, this strange 7,000-year detour that we all had to take in order to find our way back to God will finally be completed, and we'll be back at a new beginning where we were always destined to be forever. That is beautiful and amazing, and it blows my mind. Now, of course, there's other possibilities. Even just restricting ourselves to the Essene calendar, we have an entire 50 years to place events in. We can come up with similar timelines around the other two dates of Apophis Wormwood as given by NASA. For example, Israel became a nation again in 1948. Now, exactly 120 years from that is the spring of 2068, the precise time of the third arrival of Apophis, and the one that, according to NASA, has the greatest chance to strike Earth. Well, 2068 is exactly 7 years from 2075. So there would still be enough time for a tribulation period there. We could consider 2036, which is exactly 3.5 years after the 2000th anniversary of the death of Christ. So maybe the tribulation starts in 2032 AD, putting the midpoint in 2036 during the second predicted arrival of Apophis. And maybe that's when Apophis wormwood will strike. Even going before NASA, Apophis, and everything that we looked at in this chapter, if we decide to not consider the Essene calendar at all, then there's no telling when things will happen. The rapture could come in another 1,000 years or in 3 seconds. You know, Jesus could wait another 1 billion years to finally return. I don't think he's going to, but he could. You know, he can do whatever he wants. There would be no way of knowing for sure. So yes, there are other possibilities, a near infinite number of them, and maybe just leaving it at that is the safest position. But at the same time, if there is something here, would it not be our duty as Christians to let others know of at least the possibility? I mean, if we come across these connections that may or may not point to the very soon return of Christ, and we don't say anything for fear of being wrong, now how would we feel if something actually happens, proving its authenticity? You know, is there a possibility that God could be showing us a glimpse into his prophetic timetable? And if so, would we really want to ignore that? Well, there's good news. Regardless of what side of the fence that you are on concerning this entire series, the conclusion you should draw is exactly the same, and it's one that we all can agree on. It is foolish to wait if you have not given your life over to Jesus yet. Even if everything in this series, this 5-part series, is false, even if all of it is false, you never know when the exact moment of your death is coming. You never know that when that exact moment will be, but you know it's coming. You know that it's on the way, closer to you now than ever before. That moment of death is closer to you now than it was when you started watching this video. If this series plays any role in your consideration of how to live your life, let it be this, that what if this is right? What if this happens? What if the rapture comes in 2025 or before? What if your death comes before anything else prophetically? What if your death comes before anything is even meant to be fulfilled? Is there some lifestyle sin that you've been indulging in that you keep thinking you'll repent of and finally let go someday, just not yet? Would you be ready to meet the Lord today? Now, these are all serious questions to consider, no matter what your thoughts on prophecy might be. But if you are watching this video, and if you have watched this series, you probably have at least an interest in prophetic matters, especially in light of current events. And if that's the case, consider the information throughout this series in terms of your own relationship with Jesus. Given everything we discussed and how quickly things are changing throughout the world day after day, it seems like the time is very, very, very short. So make today the day that you finally know for sure you'll be included and welcomed into that final kingdom age, ruling and reigning with Christ, secure in eternity with him, and never having to fear over anything ever again. Let that day be today. I want to thank all of you so much for joining me throughout the course of this entire series. I hope you have found it beneficial. I hope it was as fun for you to watch as it was for me to teach. And I just greatly appreciate all of you and love all you so much. Thank you so much for being members. Thank you so much for supporting us at Daily Renegade and everything we do. And we just ask that you keep us in prayer, and we will keep you all in prayer as well. Until next time, that concludes this series on the Essenes, Qumran community, prophecies, Dead Sea Scrolls, prophetic timetables, all sorts of cool things. That concludes this series. Until next time, love you all, take care, and God bless.